Hello, my sleepy heads. It's good to have you back. Tonight, we'll travel far beyond the modern world, to the cradle of civilization itself. A land between two great rivers, where the first cities rose, and where humankind learned to write, to build, and to rule. This is the story of Babylon, the empire of laws, of stars, and of kings who dreamed of eternity. But before we begin, I just want to thank you for being here. If these quiet journeys through time bring you peace, or help you drift into rest, please consider liking this video and subscribing. Now, settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's return to the world of Babylon. Mesopotamia, meaning the land between rivers, refers to the fertile plains enclosed by the Tigris and Euphrates in modern-day Iraq and parts of Syria and Kuwait. It was here, more than 6,000 years ago, that the foundations of complex civilization first appeared. The region's geography shaped its destiny. The twin rivers flooded irregularly, at times nourishing the land with rich alluvial soil, and at others, devastating settlements with unpredictable torrents. Unlike the Nile, whose annual rhythm was gentle and dependable, Mesopotamia's waterways demanded constant management. This necessity for control became the stimulus for organized labor, collective planning, and eventually, the emergence of governance. By the late 4th millennium BCE, small agricultural villages had already evolved into densely populated communities. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Eridu, Uruk, and Ur reveal evidence of irrigation canals, standardized pottery, and monumental architecture. These findings indicate coordinated administration and a degree of social hierarchy. Managing water distribution required measurement, record-keeping, and supervision, activities that gave rise to scribes, overseers, and early bureaucrats. Through these networks of organized labor, Mesopotamia developed what historians often describe as the first urban civilization. Another innovation that transformed these early societies was writing. Around 3200 BCE, the Sumerians developed cuneiform, wedge-shaped impressions made on clay tablets. Initially used for accounting grain and livestock, it soon evolved into a medium for literature, law, and religion. This capacity to record transactions and traditions allowed ideas to persist across generations, stabilizing economic and social systems. The earliest texts, recovered from temple complexes, reveal a world already dependent on administrative precision and collective belief. Religion played an equally central role. Each city was considered the earthly domain of a patron deity, whose temple functioned both as a spiritual and economic center. The ziggurat, a stepped temple tower, symbolized the link between heaven and earth. These institutions accumulated surplus produce, redistributed resources, and organized labor. In effect, the temple became the nucleus of both faith and governance, merging divine authority with practical management. Trade connected these city-states to distant lands. Archaeological evidence shows imports of timber from Lebanon, copper from Oman, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Such exchanges not only enriched Mesopotamian economies, but also broadened their cultural horizons. Over time, these cities began to compete for territory and resources, giving rise to early forms of political organization and warfare. Kingship emerged as a stabilizing institution, replacing theocratic councils with centralized rule. This progression, from small farming communities to self-governing city-states, marked one of the most significant transitions in human history. It demonstrated how environmental challenges, technological innovation, and social cooperation could transform subsistence societies into structured civilizations. The combination of irrigation management, writing, and temple authority created a framework that later empires, including Babylon, would inherit and refine. Over the next centuries, this region would witness the rise and fall of many powers. From the Sumerians to the Akkadians, each contributed to a shared Mesopotamian legacy. Within this evolving landscape, a small city on the Euphrates, Babylon, would eventually emerge, drawing upon millennia of accumulated knowledge to become the center of a powerful empire. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, the cities of Sumer in southern Mesopotamia had become centers of innovation and competition. Each city-state, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and others, governed itself under a ruler known as the Ensi or Lugal. Their economies revolved around temple estates and agricultural production, while their identities were bound to local deities. The Sumerians developed an extraordinary array of advancements. Irrigation systems that transformed arid land into productive farmland, the potter's wheel, bronze metallurgy, and the world's earliest known system of writing. These developments set the template for Mesopotamian civilization as a whole. Cuneiform, first employed for economic record-keeping, evolved into a vehicle for expression and governance. Administrative tablets recorded labor rations and land distribution, while hymns, myths, and proverbs captured religious and moral thought. The Sumerian king list, a chronicle blending history with divine legitimacy, reveals how early rulers sought to anchor political authority in a sacred cosmic order. This interplay between divine mandate and earthly administration would persist throughout the region's later empires, including Babylon's. By approximately 2334 BCE, a major transformation occurred under the leadership of Sargon of Akkad. Originating from the northern region of Mesopotamia, Sargon established what is often regarded as the world's first empire. He conquered the Sumerian city-states, uniting them under a centralized administration that extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. His capital, Akkad, though its exact archaeological site remains undiscovered, became a symbol of political innovation. The Akkadian Empire replaced local governance with imperial officials, standardized weights and measures, and promoted a common language, Akkadian, a Semitic tongue that would become Babylon's linguistic foundation. Archaeological evidence from this era, including inscriptions and royal reliefs, demonstrates a new conception of kingship. The ruler was now portrayed as the chosen of the gods, a mediator between heaven and earth, and the guarantor of justice and prosperity. The empire's bureaucratic system ensured the regular collection of tribute, labor, and resources, a model later refined by Hammurabi and his successors. Yet the Akkadian Empire was not built to last indefinitely. After roughly 2 centuries, environmental stress, rebellions, and invasions by the Gutians led to its collapse around 2154 BCE. The fall of Akkad plunged Mesopotamia back into political fragmentation, but the cultural achievements of both Sumer and Akkad endured. Their systems of writing, administration, and divine kingship became permanent features of Mesopotamian life. Even centuries later, Babylonian scribes studied Sumerian as a classical language, preserving myths such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and legal precedents that shaped subsequent jurisprudence. This continuity illustrates a defining feature of Mesopotamian civilization, innovation built upon inheritance. The Sumerians provided the intellectual and technological foundations. The Akkadians established the imperial framework. Together, they formed the cultural bedrock upon which Babylon would rise. As the Akkadian world faded, new dynasties emerged from the south. Among them was a modest city on the Euphrates that began to consolidate influence under Amorite chieftains. In the centuries to come, that city, Babylon, would inherit this dual legacy and transform it into the heart of a new empire. When the power of Akkad waned and the Sumerian renaissance of the Ur-3 dynasty faded around 2000 BCE, Mesopotamia entered a new and fragmented age. Across the plains, local rulers competed for authority, each claiming succession to the old imperial legacy. Amid this landscape of shifting alliances and city-state rivalries, a modest settlement along the Euphrates River began to grow in significance. This settlement, known as Babylon in Akkadian, the Gate of God, would eventually lend its name to one of the most enduring empires in history. At first, Babylon was unremarkable. Archaeological layers from the early 2nd millennium BCE reveal a provincial town rather than a metropolitan capital. Its location, however, was strategic. Situated between major trade arteries linking Sumer in the south and Akkad in the north, Babylon controlled access to both agrarian and commercial networks. The surrounding floodplain was fertile, supporting extensive barley cultivation and animal husbandry, while nearby routes connected it to trade flowing from the Persian Gulf toward the Levant. Geography provided the foundation. time, and political acumen would supply the rest. The collapse of the UR3 dynasty left Mesopotamia politically divided. Amorite tribes, Semitic-speaking peoples who had long lived on the region's western fringes, began to settle within the great cities of the plain. These groups, though often described as outsiders, gradually assimilated into the local culture, adopting cuneiform script and Sumerian religious traditions. Over several generations, Amorite chieftains rose to power in numerous cities, establishing dynasties that blended tribal customs with Mesopotamian administrative sophistication. Babylon was one of these emerging polities. By approximately 1894 BCE, an Amorite ruler named Sumuabum established a local dynasty in Babylon. His successors, Sumalael and Sabium, began to fortify the city and extend its control over neighboring territories. Contemporary records suggest the construction of defensive walls, irrigation channels, and temples dedicated to Marduk, a deity who, though initially minor, would soon ascend to central prominence in the Babylonian pantheon. The early Amorite rulers did not command a vast empire. Their strength lay in consolidation. Through diplomacy and intercity marriage alliances, they positioned Babylon as a stable power in an otherwise turbulent region. Over the next century, Babylon's rulers expanded their administrative capabilities. Clay tablets recovered from old Babylonian archives reveal a complex bureaucratic system, contracts regulating land tenure, trade, and labor, temple records tracking offerings and rations, and early examples of standardized taxation. These documents provide a glimpse into a society gradually transitioning from local autonomy to centralized governance. The economy was based on agriculture and trade, but its stability rested on predictable irrigation, carefully monitored through canal systems maintained by temple and palace labor. One of the most striking features of this early Babylonian period is the continuity of cultural traditions inherited from Sumer and Akkad. The Sumerian language remained in use as a scholarly and religious medium, while Akkadian served as the common language of administration. This bilingualism fostered intellectual continuity, allowing scribes to preserve ancient hymns, myths, and legal precedents even as they composed new ones in the Babylonian dialect. The city's schools, idubas, trained scribes in mathematics, astronomy, and literature, creating a class of educated officials essential for governance. Religious practice in Babylon followed patterns established by earlier Mesopotamian centers, but introduced subtle shifts that would later define its identity. Marduk, the city's chief god, rose in importance through political elevation rather than theological innovation. As Babylon's influence grew, Marduk came to be regarded as a universal deity, eventually absorbing attributes of older gods such as Enlil. This theological consolidation mirrored the city's political ambitions. Just as Marduk ruled the divine assembly, so too would Babylon aspire to rule the earthly realm. Archaeological evidence from early Babylonian strata shows modest beginnings rather than monumental grandeur. Domestic structures were constructed of sun-dried mud brick, and temples, though carefully planned, lacked the imposing scale of later ziggurats. Yet beneath these humble remains lay the organizational sophistication that would support future expansion. The alignment of streets, water management systems, and defensive works suggests deliberate urban planning, a quiet testament to foresight and administrative discipline. Economically, Babylon thrived as a hub of exchange. Merchants dealt in textiles, grain, metals, and crafted goods, connecting distant regions through caravans and river transport. The city's position on the Euphrates allowed it to serve as an intermediary between southern ports and northern markets. Silver functioned as a unit of account, recorded by scribes who ensured contractual integrity in trade. These economic mechanisms, supported by legal enforcement, fostered a degree of trust essential for commerce across long distances. Politically, Babylon's rise was gradual but steady. While neighboring powers such as Larsa and Isin contended for dominance, Babylon focused on consolidation and administration. By avoiding overextension and emphasizing internal development, the Amorite dynasty ensured the city's survival amid frequent wars that devastated its rivals. The stability of this period laid the foundation for future unification under a more assertive ruler. By the early 18th century BCE, Babylon had become more than a regional power. It was poised to assume the central role once held by Akkad and Ur. The groundwork had been laid: a capable bureaucracy, a coherent religious ideology, and an economy integrated into the wider Mesopotamian world. When Hammurabi ascended the throne in 1792 BCE, he inherited not a fledgling town, but a disciplined state prepared for expansion. The story of Babylon's emergence is thus one of continuity and adaptation. Drawing from Sumerian administration, Akkadian imperial precedent, and Amorite resilience, the city synthesized centuries of experience into a new political model. Its strength lay not in innovation alone, but in integration, the ability to merge inherited systems into a coherent whole. This synthesis set the stage for transformation. The lessons learned from irrigation, record-keeping, and temple management would now be applied on a grand scale. The next phase in Babylon's history would see its consolidation into an empire under Hammurabi, a ruler whose legal and administrative vision would define the Babylonian world for centuries. When Hammurabi came to power around 1792 BCE, Babylon was already an established kingdom, but not yet an empire. He inherited a modest realm from his father, Simubalit, surrounded by rival Amorite dynasties and older, wealthier city-states such as Larsa, Eshnunna, and Mari. Each of these powers vied for control over the fertile plains and vital trade routes of Mesopotamia. The political map was fragmented, a patchwork of kingdoms that had arisen after the decline of the Ur-3 dynasty and the subsequent centuries of decentralization. Hammurabi's task was to transform this fractured landscape into a unified, stable polity under Babylonian authority. At the time of his accession, Hammurabi was one of several regional rulers with limited territorial influence. His early reign focused on consolidation rather than conquest. Surviving inscriptions and administrative records indicate that he prioritized internal development, restoring temples, strengthening canal systems, and reforming taxation to secure the loyalty of urban and rural elites. These projects not only enhanced agricultural productivity, but also reinforced Babylon's legitimacy as a center of divine favor and economic order. The king's titles reflected both sacred duty and pragmatic governance. He was the shepherd of his people, a term implying moral stewardship as much as political authority. The environment in which Hammurabi operated was one of constant negotiation and shifting alliances. The rival kingdoms of Larsa in the south and Eshnunna in the north frequently sought dominance through warfare and diplomacy. To survive, Babylon had to play a careful game of balance. Cuneiform letters from the period reveal a ruler skilled in both strategy and patience, forming temporary alliances when necessary, avoiding premature conflict, and consolidating resources before taking decisive action. His approach was methodical, reflecting an understanding that enduring power depended as much on stability and administration as on military success. Over the next 2 decades, Hammurabi's influence expanded gradually. By securing the cooperation of local governors and temple administrators, he ensured that Babylon's authority extended beyond the capital into rural districts. The reconstruction of irrigation systems, especially along the Euphrates, improved agricultural yields and reduced the likelihood of famine, a critical factor in maintaining public confidence. The prosperity generated by these reforms financed the maintenance of armies and public works, strengthening both the economic and military foundations of the kingdom. Around the middle of his reign, Hammurabi began to assert more overt political and military ambition. A series of campaigns brought Babylon into direct conflict with neighboring states. In alliance with Mari and Eshnunna, Hammurabi defeated Larsa, thereby gaining control over the southern region of Sumer. This victory was a turning point. It secured access to vital trade routes and the rich agricultural lands that had sustained Mesopotamian civilizations for millennia. Soon afterward, he turned against his former allies, extending Babylonian dominion northward into Akkad and Eshnunna. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi ruled nearly all of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the Upper Tigris, an achievement unprecedented since the days of Sargon of Akkad. The unification of Mesopotamia under Hammurabi was not achieved solely through conquest. It was underpinned by administration, diplomacy, and ideological authority. He positioned himself as a restorer of order, claiming divine sanction from Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. Inscriptions from his reign emphasized justice, law, and the welfare of his subjects, values that would soon be codified in one of history's most enduring legal documents. His empire, though built upon military success, rested on a vision of centralized governance and moral order. By the end of the 18th century BCE, Babylon had transformed from a regional power into the dominant political and cultural force of the ancient Near East. Its language became the lingua franca of diplomacy, its gods revered across neighboring lands, and its administration emulated by successor states. Hammurabi's consolidation marked a decisive moment in world history, the creation of a structured empire governed by law and sustained through careful organization. The stability Hammurabi achieved demanded more than force. It required a framework of shared values and rules. To secure this unity, he turned to a project that would define his legacy and influence legal thought for millennia, the codification of law itself. In the closing decades of Hammurabi's reign, Babylon reached the height of its political and administrative maturity. The unification of Mesopotamia under his authority created not only a vast territorial empire, but also an urgent need for standardized governance. Diverse peoples, Sumerians, Akkadians, Amorites, and others, now lived under a single ruler. Each region had its own customs, traditions, and local laws. For Hammurabi to preserve stability, he required a coherent framework that would define justice, regulate society, and legitimize his authority across the empire. The result was one of the most remarkable achievements of the ancient world, the Code of Hammurabi. Carved onto a tall diorite stele more than 2 meters high, the code contained 282 articles inscribed in cuneiform script. Discovered in 1901 by French archaeologists at Su, the text begins with a prologue in which Hammurabi declares his divine commission. According to the inscription, the gods Anu and Enlil entrusted Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, with the guidance of humanity, and Marduk in turn appointed Hammurabi to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and evil, and to ensure that the strong do not oppress the weak. This invocation positioned the king not merely as a ruler, but as a divinely sanctioned guardian of order. The laws themselves cover virtually every aspect of life in Old Babylonian society. They address issues of property, trade, agriculture, family relations, labor, and personal injury. Each article follows a consistent pattern, a conditional clause describing an offense, followed by a prescribed consequence. The punishments are often severe, reflecting a principle of proportional justice, famously summarized as an eye for an eye. Yet, this principle was not universal. The code distinguished between social classes. Offenses committed against members of higher ranks carried harsher penalties, while similar acts against lower-status individuals or slaves incurred lesser consequences. This stratification reveals a society deeply conscious of hierarchy, but also aware of its obligations to maintain order within that hierarchy. The Code of Hammurabi was more than a collection of decrees. It represented a philosophical statement about the nature of justice and authority. By inscribing his laws in stone and displaying them publicly, Hammurabi proclaimed that law was no longer the private domain of priests or local officials. It was a universal standard, visible to all, even if few could read it. The stele symbolized permanence, an unchanging moral foundation upon which society could rely. In effect, it transformed the ruler's will into an enduring institution, linking divine order to civic obedience. From an administrative perspective, the code provided practical benefits. It standardized legal expectations across the empire, allowing judges and officials to apply consistent rulings. Contracts, loans, and property disputes could now be evaluated against written precedents. This predictability strengthened the economy, as merchants and farmers operated with clearer understanding of their rights and obligations. The detailed regulations concerning irrigation, for example, illustrate the close connection between law and environment. In a region dependent on controlled water systems, Negligence in maintaining canals or flooding another's field was punishable by fines or restitution. Law thus became a tool of resource management as well as social discipline. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that Hammurabi's code was not the first of its kind. Earlier legal traditions existed in Mesopotamia, such as the laws of Uar-Nemu and Lipitishtar. However, Hammurabi's version surpassed them in scope, organization, and symbolic power. Its preamble and epilogue framed justice as an extension of divine harmony, reinforcing the belief that moral and political order were inseparable. This concept of the king as lawgiver would resonate through later civilizations, from the Hittites and Persians to the Greeks and Romans, eventually influencing the very idea of codified law in modern societies. The code also offers insight into the daily life of Babylonian citizens. It protects merchants from fraud, farmers from negligence, and artisans from unfair contracts. It recognizes property rights and sets out penalties for theft, assault, and breach of contract. Family law occupies a significant portion of the text, detailing marriage agreements, inheritance, and the responsibilities of parents and children. While modern readers may view many of its provisions as harsh, they reflect an early attempt to regulate human behavior through reasoned, publicly acknowledged rules rather than arbitrary power. One of the most profound features of the stele lies in its conclusion. The epilogue asserts Hammurabi's legacy as a just ruler and curses any future monarch who might disregard or alter his words. This rhetorical closure served as both moral warning and political statement. Justice, once established, was to be preserved as a sacred trust. It illustrates a worldview in which the king's authority derived not only from conquest, but from his role as custodian of divine law. In later centuries, copies and echoes of Hammurabi's code continued to circulate among scribes and administrators. Even as Babylon fell to new powers, the principles it articulated, accountability, documentation, and standardized justice, remained integral to governance throughout the ancient Near East. The Code of Hammurabi thus represents more than a legal milestone. It embodies a transformation in human thought. For the first time, law stood as a permanent, visible covenant between ruler and people, binding them in a shared moral and civic order. It unified a diverse empire under a single ideal, that society must be governed by justice grounded in divine legitimacy and human responsibility. This concept of ordered governance became the cornerstone of Babylon's stability. With law as its foundation, the empire could sustain prosperity, trade, and urban life across its vast territory. The next stage in Babylon's history would reveal how these principles shaped everyday existence within the empire's capital, the lived reality of Hammurabi's Babylon. At the height of Hammurabi's rule in the 18th century BCE, Babylon had become not only the political heart of Mesopotamia, but also a model of urban life. The city stood on the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, its prosperity dependent on the steady rhythm of irrigation and the organized labor that sustained it. Archaeological and textual sources, from clay tablets to temple records, offer a picture of a sophisticated society governed by structured administration, complex economy, and deeply embedded religious traditions. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed for all to see, reflected this order. But beyond the carved laws lay the daily workings of a city that served as the nerve center of an empire. Babylon itself was a walled metropolis of perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, a remarkable scale for its time. Its streets were laid out around temples, palaces, and marketplaces. The central ziggurat, dedicated to Marduk, rose above the city, symbolizing the divine axis between heaven and earth. The temple complex not only served religious functions, but also acted as an economic institution, controlling vast tracts of land and employing large numbers of workers. Priests managed accounts, oversaw offerings, and recorded transactions on clay tablets that were carefully stored in archives. This administrative precision was a defining feature of Babylonian civilization. Nearly every transaction, from grain distribution to land rental, was documented, revealing a society built on record-keeping and accountability. Most citizens lived in single-story mud brick houses arranged along narrow alleys. Their homes reflected the social structure of the city, merchants and officials occupying larger dwellings with courtyards, while artisans and laborers lived in more modest quarters. Daily life revolved around work, family, and religion. Agricultural labor remained the foundation of the economy, supported by craftsmen who produced textiles, pottery, and metal goods. Trade was extensive, linking Babylon with distant regions such as Anatolia, Elam, and the Levant. Caravans and riverboats carried goods along established routes, while silver served as a standard measure of value in commercial exchanges. Babylonian society was hierarchical yet functional. At the top stood the royal court and priesthood, followed by landowners, merchants, and skilled professionals such as scribes and physicians. Below them were laborers and slaves, many of whom were debt servants rather than captives. The Code of Hammurabi codified these distinctions, ensuring each class had defined rights and obligations. For example, contracts between free men and slaves were regulated to prevent disputes, while wages for artisans and laborers were standardized according to skill and task. Though inequality was pronounced, this framework provided a predictable order that allowed the city to function efficiently. Religion was central to Babylonian identity. The worship of Marduk unified the empire under a common faith, while local deities remained honored in their respective regions. Rituals, festivals, and offerings structured the calendar, reinforcing social cohesion and the perceived harmony between divine will and human endeavor. Temples served as centers of education as well. Scribes trained within their precincts mastered the cuneiform script and maintained records for both religious and administrative purposes. Literacy was rare but highly valued, a tool of governance and cultural continuity. One of the most striking aspects of Hammurabi's Babylon was its integration of legal and religious authority. The king's role as a lawgiver and protector of justice was intertwined with his duty to uphold divine order. When citizens brought disputes before judges, verdicts were often delivered in the presence of the god, signifying that justice was sacred as well as civic. This duality lent Babylonian law both its moral weight and its resilience. It fostered a sense of belonging grounded in the conviction that society operated under divine supervision. Economic documents from the period reveal a vibrant system of credit and contract. Merchants borrowed silver or goods for trade expeditions, repaying with interest upon their return. Farmers leased fields from temple estates or wealthy landowners, paying a share of the harvest as rent. Women, too, played active roles in commerce and property ownership, as numerous tablets record loans, dowries, and inheritances administered by female citizens. While patriarchal norms defined the broader social structure, Babylonian law recognized women's legal capacity, granting them rights to own property and pursue claims in court. The city's prosperity was sustained by its control of water. Irrigation canals extended like veins across the countryside, their maintenance coordinated by local officials. The efficiency of these systems determined agricultural yields and, by extension, the wealth of the entire state. The Code of Hammurabi's detailed provisions on irrigation, imposing fines for neglect or sabotage, underscore how central water management was to Babylonian civilization. In a land of unpredictable rivers, law became a safeguard against environmental chaos. Cultural life thrived alongside administration and economy. Hymns, epics, and prayers were inscribed on tablets, preserving the linguistic and literary heritage of Sumer and Akkad while introducing a distinctly Babylonian voice. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though older in origin, was copied and adapted during this period, symbolizing the intellectual continuity of Mesopotamian civilization. Education and record-keeping linked the past to the present, ensuring that knowledge, from mathematics to medicine, was transmitted across generations. By the end of Hammurabi's reign, Babylon had achieved a balance between central authority and local administration, divine faith and civic duty, tradition and innovation. Its citizens lived within a system where law, economy, and belief converged to sustain a complex urban society. The success of this structure would allow the empire to endure beyond Hammurabi's lifetime, influencing neighboring regions and shaping Near Eastern civilization for centuries. Yet the seeds of transformation were already present. As Babylon prospered, its territories stretched thin, and the maintenance of order across distant provinces grew increasingly difficult. The mechanisms that had unified the empire, law, bureaucracy, and ideology, would soon be tested by challenges from both within and beyond its borders. The next chapter explores these transitions, the strains of succession, shifting alliances, and the enduring quest to preserve Hammurabi's legacy in an era of political change. When Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE, the Babylonian Empire stood as the dominant power in Mesopotamia. For nearly half a century, his rule had brought stability, law, and prosperity to a region long accustomed to political fragmentation. Yet the very achievements that made Babylon powerful also made it vulnerable. The empire's cohesion depended heavily on the personal authority and administrative oversight of its ruler. Hammurabi's death marked the first real test of whether his centralized system could survive without its architect. The period that followed revealed both the strength and fragility of the structure he had built. Hammurabi was succeeded by his son Samsu-iluna, who inherited not only an extensive empire but also the burdens of governance over diverse peoples and distant provinces. At the time of his accession, Babylonian control stretched from the Persian Gulf to the upper Tigris, encompassing regions with distinct languages, traditions, and loyalties. Maintaining unity required both administrative efficiency and military readiness. Samsu-iluna's early years were occupied with consolidating power, reaffirming the loyalty of local governors, securing temple revenues, and suppressing unrest in peripheral cities. The surviving inscriptions portray him as a pious ruler in the mold of his father, dedicated to the gods and committed to justice. But the realities of his reign soon proved far more turbulent. The first major challenge arose from within the southern regions of Sumer and Akkad, where local rulers began to reassert their independence. Revolts erupted in cities such as Uar, Isin, and Uruk, each led by claimants invoking the legitimacy of earlier dynasties. The causes of these uprisings were complex. Economic hardship, heavy taxation, and the perceived distance of Babylonian authority all contributed. Archaeological evidence of abandoned settlements and destroyed temples in these areas suggests that the revolts were both widespread and destructive. Samsu-iluna responded with force, launching campaigns to re-establish control, but the repeated need for military intervention drained resources and eroded public confidence. At the same time, external threats intensified. To the north and east, new groups such as the Kassites and Elamites began to encroach on Babylonian territory. These incursions, though initially limited, signaled the gradual weakening of Babylon's borders. The empire's reliance on a network of local governors and vassals, once its strength, now became a liability as regional loyalties wavered. Without Hammurabi's personal authority to mediate disputes and enforce discipline, provincial leaders increasingly acted in their own interests. The administrative correspondence from this period reveals growing difficulties in communication, delayed tribute payments, and the need for repeated royal decrees to reassert central control. Samsu-iluna attempted to stabilize his rule through both ideological and practical means. He continued his father's policy of temple restoration, emphasizing divine favor as the foundation of his kingship. Inscriptions describe his dedication to Marduk and Shamash, the gods of justice and light, as symbols of lawful rule. Yet religious legitimacy could not compensate for the material strains of empire. The economic records show signs of contraction, declining agricultural output, reduced temple income, and disrupted trade networks. The irrigation systems that had sustained the Babylonian heartland began to suffer from neglect, as labor and resources were redirected to military needs. The crisis was not simply political, it was structural. Hammurabi's empire had relied on a delicate balance between centralized authority and local autonomy. When that balance faltered, the entire system began to fragment. Over the course of Samsu-iluna's reign, many southern cities were abandoned or depopulated, their populations migrating northward to more secure regions. This demographic shift marked a profound transformation in Mesopotamian settlement patterns. The once thriving Sumerian cities, cradle of early civilization, entered a period of irreversible decline. Despite these challenges, Samsu-Iluna managed to preserve Babylon itself and its northern territories. His inscriptions speak of victories against rebels and foreign invaders, and there is evidence that he maintained control over key parts of the empire for several decades. However, the nature of Babylonian rule changed. The empire became more defensive, inward-looking, and reliant on the capital's immediate resources. Administrative centers in the south ceased to function as they had under Hammurabi, and the empire's communication network weakened. What had once been a unified realm increasingly resembled a federation of semi-independent regions acknowledging Babylon's supremacy in name more than in practice. The decline of central authority had long-term consequences. It opened the way for new powers to rise in Mesopotamia and for shifting cultural influences to reshape the region. In the centuries that followed, the Kassites would establish their own dynasty in Babylon, preserving elements of Hammurabi's legacy while transforming the nature of Babylonian identity. But in the immediate aftermath of Hammurabi's death, the empire entered a phase of contraction that revealed how dependent its stability had been on a single ruler's capacity to govern a complex world. The succession crisis of the mid-18th century BCE was thus not a sudden collapse, but a gradual unraveling, the transition from imperial unity to regional autonomy. It exposed the limitations of early bureaucratic states and the challenges of sustaining empire across vast and diverse lands. Yet, even amid this decline, the intellectual and administrative foundations laid by Hammurabi endured. His laws continued to influence justice. His city remained a center of religion and learning. The Babylonian name, though temporarily diminished, would survive to inspire new dynasties and cultural renaissances in the centuries to come. The next section explores how Babylon adapted in this transitional era, how its rulers and people navigated contraction, reorganization, and the enduring quest to preserve identity in a changing Mesopotamian world. The decades following Hammurabi's death marked a turning point in Mesopotamian history. Under his successors, the once unified Babylonian Empire entered a prolonged phase of fragmentation. Political control weakened, trade declined, and the old Sumerian heartlands in the south began to lose their vitality. Yet the story of this era is not merely one of collapse. It is also one of adaptation, the transformation of Babylonian civilization in response to shifting political, economic, and environmental realities. From the turmoil of the mid-18th century BC emerged new patterns of governance, settlement, and culture that would define Mesopotamia for centuries. Samsu-Iluna's later years saw the gradual withdrawal of Babylonian authority from the far south. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Ur, Uruk, and Larsa indicates widespread abandonment during this period. Irrigation canals, once meticulously maintained, silted over as local populations dispersed. The reasons were both political and environmental. Continuous warfare disrupted canal maintenance, and changing river courses made some lands less fertile. Without centralized oversight, agricultural productivity declined, prompting migrations northward toward the more stable regions near Babylon and the Middle Euphrates. This shift marked the effective end of the old Sumerian urban system, the network of independent temple cities that had dominated southern Mesopotamia for over a millennium. In the north, however, Babylonian culture persisted. The capital itself remained a thriving administrative and religious center. Although its sphere of influence had contracted, Babylon continued to serve as the symbolic heart of the region. The city's temples still received offerings, its scribes still copied texts, and its markets still facilitated trade along the Euphrates. Samsu-Iluna and his successors, such as Abieshu and Amidatana, sought to reinforce continuity by maintaining the rituals and institutions established under Hammurabi. Royal inscriptions from this period emphasized temple restoration and the favor of Marduk, an assertion of divine legitimacy amid uncertainty. Economically, the empire's fragmentation forced adaptation. With long-distance trade disrupted, local production became increasingly important. Records from northern Mesopotamian towns show renewed emphasis on subsistence agriculture and small-scale industry. Merchants adjusted their networks, focusing on regional exchanges rather than interregional trade. Although the scale of commerce diminished, The mechanisms of contract, credit, and documentation endured. The use of standardized weights and measures, developed under Hammurabi, continued to regulate transactions, ensuring that economic life retained a degree of structure even as political unity faded. Culturally, this era witnessed a consolidation of Babylonian identity. The literary and religious traditions codified in the Old Babylonian period became the foundation of later Mesopotamian civilization. Scribes preserved and recopied texts, ensuring the transmission of the Akkadian language and the cuneiform script. Educational tablets from this period show that classic Sumerian hymns, myths, and proverbs remained central to scribal training. In this way, the intellectual heritage of Sumer and Akkad survived the decline of their cities, absorbed into the enduring framework of Babylonian scholarship. Religion, too, adapted to new circumstances. While the cult of Marduk remained preeminent in Babylon, regional deities gained prominence in their local contexts. Shrines and temples in outlying towns often served as centers of administration and community life, filling the void left by weakened royal control. This decentralization of religious authority mirrored the political fragmentation of the time. Yet it also ensured the persistence of spiritual life and the continuity of ritual practices across Mesopotamia. The shared pantheon and ceremonial traditions maintained a sense of cultural unity even in the absence of centralized government. Politically, the successors of Samsuiluna struggled to maintain authority against both internal unrest and external incursions. The Elamites pressed from the east, while the Kassites, a people from the Zagros Mountains, began to establish footholds in northern Babylonia. Initially regarded as foreign intruders, the Kassites gradually integrated into the political landscape, serving as mercenaries, administrators, and settlers. Over time, they would become the architects of Babylon's next great revival. But in the intervening century, the region endured instability and demographic change. Many smaller kingdoms emerged in peripheral areas, each claiming local legitimacy while acknowledging, at least nominally, Babylon's cultural preeminence. Despite the disintegration of empire, the memory of Hammurabi's achievements remained vivid. His name appeared in royal inscriptions as a model of just and capable rule. Later kings invoked him as the archetype of lawful kingship, associating their reigns with his legacy. This enduring reverence for the past became a stabilizing factor in a world otherwise marked by flux. Babylonian identity was no longer purely political. It had become civilizational, defined by shared language, law, and devotion to Marduk. Archaeological and textual evidence from this period also reveals the endurance of legal and bureaucratic practices. Tablets from smaller towns demonstrate that local officials continued to apply the principles of Hammurabi's code in adjudicating disputes and managing land. While the centralized state apparatus had weakened, the habits of documentation and legal reasoning persisted. These traditions would later underpin the Kassite administrative reforms and ensure continuity between the Old Babylonian and Middle Babylonian periods. The fragmentation of the Babylonian Empire, therefore, did not represent the disappearance of its civilization but its transformation. Political authority became localized, but cultural cohesion remained. The empire had evolved into a network of interrelated communities that shared a common heritage, a phenomenon that allowed Mesopotamian civilization to survive the cyclical rise and fall of dynasties. This pattern of adaptation, visible throughout Near Eastern history, demonstrates the resilience of the institutions first consolidated under Hammurabi. By the close of the 17th century BCE, Babylon was no longer the imperial power it once had been, but it endured as a cultural and religious capital. Its scribes continued to preserve knowledge, its priests upheld ritual order, and its citizens maintained the rhythms of daily life within its walls. The world beyond, however, was changing rapidly. New powers were rising on the frontiers, bringing fresh challenges and opportunities. Among them were the Kassites, once outsiders, soon to become the custodians of Babylon's next great age. The next section traces this transformation, how the Kassites entered Babylonian history, restored stability, and redefined what it meant to rule in the name of Babylon. By the mid-16th century BCE, Babylon lay weakened from generations of internal unrest and foreign incursions. The city that had once commanded the entirety of Mesopotamia now faced a world transformed. The old Amorite dynasty, descended from Hammurabi, had gradually lost control. Across the region, rival states contended for influence. The Sealand dynasty in the far south, the Elamites to the east, and the rising Mitanni kingdom to the northwest. Into this fractured landscape stepped a new power, the Kassites, a people from the Zagros Mountains whose endurance and adaptability would define the next 4 centuries of Babylonian history. The Kassites first appear in Mesopotamian records during Hammurabi's later years, described as highland tribes inhabiting the borderlands east of the Tigris. Initially, they were regarded as outsiders, pastoral and semi-nomadic groups distinct in language and custom from the settled Mesopotamians. Their early interactions with Babylon were often military. Some served as mercenaries in Babylonian armies, others as occasional raiders along the frontier. Yet over time, the Kassites began to assimilate. They adopted Akkadian as a written language, embraced Babylonian religious traditions, and participated in regional trade networks. This process of gradual integration set the stage for their eventual rise to power. The turning point came during the decline of the First Babylonian dynasty. Around 1595 BCE, the Hittite king Mursalai I launched a sudden campaign deep into Mesopotamia, capturing Babylon and carrying off its treasures and sacred statues, an event recorded both in Mesopotamian chronicles and later Hittite sources. The Hittite presence was brief. They withdrew soon after, leaving a power vacuum in their wake. In the ensuing instability, the Kassites advanced from the east and took control of Babylon. Their takeover was not marked by widespread destruction, suggesting that it may have involved a combination of military intervention and negotiated settlement. By approximately 1570 BCE, the Kassite dynasty was firmly established, ushering in what historians now call the Kassite period or the Middle Babylonian era. The Kassites proved remarkably adept rulers. Rather than impose their own culture upon Babylon, they absorbed and preserved the traditions of their predecessors. They adopted Babylonian administrative systems, respected the authority of local temples, and maintained the cult of Marduk as the empire's spiritual core. This approach fostered legitimacy and stability in a land weary of conflict. Over the following centuries, the Kassite kings would transform Babylon from a weakened city-state into a prosperous and enduring kingdom, one that endured longer than any other dynasty in Mesopotamian history. Central to Kassite governance was a pragmatic balance between continuity and innovation. They retained the bureaucratic framework developed under Hammurabi, including land tenure systems and regional administration, but they also introduced new practices to suit a changing world. One such innovation was the Kaduru, or boundary stone, which recorded royal land grants and tax exemptions. These inscribed stones, often adorned with symbols of gods, served as both legal documents and expressions of royal favor. The Kaduru system exemplified Kassite statecraft, law, religion, and governance intertwined in tangible form. Economically, the Kassite era witnessed recovery and expansion. Agricultural production stabilized, supported by renewed canal maintenance and improved management of temple estates. Trade routes reopened, linking Babylon to Elam, Assyria, and the Persian Gulf. The kingdom became a major participant in the Late Bronze Age international order, exchanging goods and diplomatic correspondence with Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mitanni. Kassite kings appear in the Amarna letters, a collection of 14th century BC diplomatic tablets discovered in Egypt, addressing the pharaoh as an equal and exchanging gifts of gold, horses, and lapis lazuli. These records illustrate how Babylon reemerged as a respected member of the Near Eastern community of powers. Culturally, the Kassite ascendancy marked a period of synthesis. While the Kassites introduced some of their own customs, personal names, certain deities such as Shukamuna and Shumaliah, they largely adopted Babylonian art, language, and architecture. Temples and palaces built during this period followed traditional Mesopotamian designs, blending old motifs with subtle new influences. The city of Dur-Kurigalzu, founded near modern Baghdad by the Kassite king Kurigalzu I, became a symbol of this synthesis, a royal residence that mirrored Babylon's grandeur, complete with a ziggurat dedicated to Enlil. The longevity of Kassite rule, spanning roughly 4 centuries, was due in part to their administrative flexibility. They maintained a decentralized but stable structure, allowing local elites significant autonomy while ensuring loyalty through religious patronage and land grants. The priesthood of Marduk remained central to royal ideology, linking divine favor to political legitimacy. This continuity preserved the Babylonian cultural identity even as the ruling dynasty's ethnic origins receded into the background. By the 14th century BCE, the Kassites were no longer regarded as foreigners. They had become Babylonian in every practical sense. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that the Kassite era was one of relative peace and material prosperity. The countryside recovered, population centers expanded, and monumental architecture reappeared after a long hiatus. The Kassites also played a crucial role in transmitting Babylonian scholarship, mathematics, astronomy, and literature to later cultures. Many of the classic literary works of Mesopotamia, including refined versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, were recopied and standardized during this time. In preserving these traditions, the Kassites ensured Babylon's intellectual continuity through one of the most transformative periods of Near Eastern history. By the late 13th century BCE, however, the balance that had sustained Kassite rule began to weaken. External pressures mounted as new powers emerged: Assyria to the north, Elam to the east, and later the incursions of migrating tribes destabilized the region. Yet the foundations laid by the Kassites would endure. Their centuries of governance had restored Babylon's prestige, re-established its role in international diplomacy, and embedded its culture across the Near East. The Kassite ascendancy, therefore, stands as a paradoxical chapter in Babylonian history. Foreign in origin yet loyal to Babylon's traditions, the Kassites transformed conquest into cultural stewardship. They demonstrated that empire could be maintained not through domination alone, but through adaptation and respect for inherited institutions. In the next section, the narrative turns to the high point of Kassite Babylon, its golden age of international diplomacy, cultural refinement, and far-reaching influence during the late Bronze Age world system. By the 14th century BCE, Babylon under the Kassites had entered a period of consolidation and outward engagement. The kingdom, stable and well-administered, stood among the great powers of the late Bronze Age, a complex web of states stretching from the Aegean to the Iranian plateau. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mitanni, and Assyria formed the other principal nodes in this network. For the first time in recorded history, diplomacy, correspondence, and regulated exchange bound these distant realms together in what historians sometimes call the Club of Great Kings. Babylon, once isolated amid its river plains, now operated as an equal participant in this early international system. The main evidence for Babylon's place in this world order comes from the Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets discovered in Egypt at the site of Akhetaten, the capital of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of diplomacy, these letters include exchanges between Kassite rulers and the Egyptian court. They reveal a tone of parity. Babylonian kings addressed the pharaoh as "my brother," implying equal rank among sovereigns. The content of these messages was typically transactional: requests for gold, fine linen, horses, or brides to cement dynastic alliances. Yet beyond material exchange, they convey a remarkable sense of structured international relations. Babylon was not merely surviving. It was participating in a shared diplomatic culture governed by precedent and mutual recognition. These letters also offer glimpses into the Kassite worldview. The kings of Babylon present themselves as guardians of an ancient civilization, heirs to Hammurabi and custodians of Marduk's city. They emphasize continuity, piety, and good governance. In contrast to the more militarized tone of Hittite or Assyrian correspondence, Babylonian messages project stability and refinement. Archaeological evidence supports this image. The Kassite state invested heavily in infrastructure, rebuilt temples, and maintained irrigation networks essential to agricultural productivity. Its wealth derived less from conquest than from the efficient management of fertile lands and control of long-distance trade routes. Trade under the Kassites connected Mesopotamia to a far-reaching economic world. Tin and copper flowed from Anatolia and Iran, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, and luxury goods from Egypt and the Gulf. Babylon's artisans worked these imports into fine metalwork, jewelry, and textiles, much of which circulated as tribute or diplomatic gifts. Excavations at sites such as Nippur and Dur-Kirigalzu have revealed imported goods, faience from Egypt, Hittite ceramics, and seals inscribed with foreign motifs, indicating that Babylon was a nodal point in the exchange networks of the Late Bronze Age. The Kassite monarchy maintained this international standing through a combination of diplomacy and cultural prestige. While their armies were capable, the Kassites rarely pursued large-scale campaigns beyond Mesopotamia. Their strength lay in their legitimacy as rulers of Babylon, a city whose religious authority carried weight across the ancient Near East. The great temples, especially the Sagila of Marduk, were centers not only of worship but also of economic administration. Priests managed land, labor, and produce, functioning as a stabilizing force within the empire. In return, the Kassite kings patronized these institutions, endowing them with lands and privileges recorded on Kaduru stones. This mutually reinforcing relationship between temple and throne became the cornerstone of Kassite governance. Dur-Kirigalzu, the royal capital founded by Kirigalzu I and expanded by his successors, epitomized the Kassite synthesis of tradition and innovation. Excavations have revealed a vast complex featuring a ziggurat dedicated to Enlil, administrative buildings, and palaces adorned with glazed brick and inscribed foundation tablets. The city's design mirrored Babylonian urban ideals, symmetry, hierarchy, and proximity between palace and temple, yet it bore distinct Kassite features such as the use of mountain motifs and unique royal iconography. From this capital, the Kassite kings managed their diplomatic correspondence and organized state rituals affirming divine kingship. The Kassite period also witnessed a refinement of Babylonian scholarship. Administrative texts, lexical lists, and astronomical records from Nippur and Uruk show that scribes continued to preserve and systematize the intellectual legacy of earlier ages. During this era, many classical works of Mesopotamian literature were recopied and canonized, including the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Kassite rulers did not originate these texts, but their sponsorship ensured their transmission through later centuries. In this sense, Kassite Babylon functioned as a conservator of Mesopotamian civilization, preserving knowledge at a time when many neighboring cultures were still developing written traditions of their own. One of the most significant features of this period was the emergence of Babylon as a cultural model beyond its borders. Akkadian, originally the language of imperial administration under Sargon of Akkad, now became the diplomatic script of the entire Near East. Scribes from Canaan to Anatolia learned to write in Babylonian cuneiform, copying formulas and expressions first standardized in the Kassite chancery. Through this process, Babylonian culture acquired a transnational dimension. Even as political power waxed and waned, the prestige of Babylonian language and learning endured, shaping the administrative systems of later empires. By the 13th century BCE, however, the international order that had sustained Kassite Babylon began to show signs of strain. The Mitanni kingdom fell under Hittite and Assyrian pressure, Egypt's external reach diminished, and trade routes became increasingly unstable. New groups, the Arameans, the Elamites, and later the Sea Peoples, disrupted established patterns of exchange and settlement. The Kassite kings, who had relied on balance and diplomacy, now faced a world in flux. Yet even as the geopolitical landscape shifted, Babylon's intellectual and religious authority remained intact. The city continued to serve as a spiritual and cultural reference point long after its political dominance began to fade. The Late Bronze Age world brought Babylon unprecedented connectivity, prosperity, and prestige. Under the Kassites, the city became not just the political heart of Mesopotamia, but also the intellectual capital of the ancient Near East. Its scholars, diplomats, and artisans contributed to a shared civilization that transcended borders, a world briefly united by writing, trade, and ritual. As this interconnected system began to collapse in the 12th century BCE, Babylon would once again confront transformation. The next phase of its history, the era of invasions, disruptions, and eventual recovery, would test the resilience of the traditions the Kassites had so carefully preserved. By the late 13th century BCE, the Kassite dynasty had ruled Babylon for nearly 400 years, longer than any preceding line of kings. Yet the world around them was changing in ways that no state, however well-governed, could ignore. Across the Near East, the interconnected system that had defined the Late Bronze Age was beginning to unravel. Long-distance trade networks faltered, alliances collapsed, and regional powers turned inward. The Kassite kingdom, built on stability and diplomacy, found itself ill-equipped to withstand the new age of turbulence that was descending upon Mesopotamia. The causes of this transformation were complex and interrelated. Environmental fluctuations likely contributed to declining agricultural yields. Movements of peoples, such as the Arameans and nomadic tribes from the western deserts, disrupted settled regions. To the north, Assyria emerged as a formidable military power under kings like Tukulti-Ninurta I, whose ambitions extended deep into Babylonia. To the east, Elam, a longtime rival and trading partner, was regaining strength under a revitalized dynasty. In this volatile context, Kassite Babylon faced mounting pressure from all directions. The first major blow came from Assyria. Around 1235 BCE, Tukulti-Ninurta I launched a series of campaigns into Babylonian territory. His inscriptions, carved on monumental stele, claim that he defeated the Babylonian king Kashtiliash IV and captured the city of Babylon itself. Contemporary Babylonian sources confirm the event, describing the looting of temples and the removal of the statue of Marduk to Assur, a symbolic act of immense significance. In Mesopotamian thought, a city's divine statue embodied its god's presence. Its removal meant divine abandonment. Although Assyrian control over Babylon proved brief, this invasion dealt a lasting psychological and political shock to the Kassite regime. In the aftermath, Babylon fell into a period of fragmentation. Local rulers and rival claimants vied for legitimacy, while provincial governors asserted greater autonomy. The Kassite kings who followed struggled to restore central authority. Diplomatic correspondence from this era ceases, suggesting that Babylon's participation in the international system effectively ended. Economically, trade contracted, and the once bustling caravan routes through Mesopotamia grew perilous. Archaeological strata from Nippur, Babylon, and other cities reveal signs of decline, reduced construction, simpler material culture, and interruptions in temple endowments. The orderly world of Kassite administration was giving way to instability. The second and decisive blow came from Elam. Around 1155 BCE, the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahani invaded Babylon, exploiting the kingdom's weakened state. Elamite inscriptions and Babylonian chronicles alike record the devastation that followed. Shutruk-Nahani captured the city, deposed the last Kassite ruler, Enlil-nadin-Ahi, and carried off vast spoils, including the famed stele of Hammurabi and numerous cult statues. These artifacts were transported to Susa, where they were displayed as trophies of conquest. The removal of Babylon's sacred objects once again symbolized divine displeasure and political collapse. The Kassite dynasty, after 4 centuries of rule, had come to an abrupt end. The fall of the Kassites did not mark the destruction of Babylonian civilization, but rather a profound transformation. The city itself survived, though diminished. Its temples were eventually restored, and its people endured, but political authority passed into the hands of successive foreign powers, first the Elamites, then the Arameans, and later a succession of local dynasts struggling to re-establish order. The Kassite language and identity, never widespread beyond the ruling elite, faded from history. Their achievements, however, continued to shape the institutions of Babylonian governance and religion for centuries to come. The Kassite period's decline coincided with the broader disintegration of the Late Bronze Age world. Across the eastern Mediterranean, kingdoms collapsed, cities were abandoned, and writing systems disappeared. In this larger context, Babylon's endurance, even in weakened form, stands out. While many contemporary states vanished entirely, Babylon's cultural and religious continuity enabled it to recover repeatedly from political disaster. The persistence of its scribal schools, temple bureaucracy, and religious institutions provided the framework for eventual renewal under new dynasties. Modern historians view the Kassite collapse not simply as a fall, but as a transition. The administrative reforms and land tenure systems developed under Kassite rule continued into the post-Kassite era. The Kaduru stones remained important legal instruments, while Kassite-era temple archives influenced later Babylonian accounting and record-keeping practices. Even the city planning principles established in Dirk-Urigalzu found echoes in later royal projects. In this way, the Kassites' contribution to Babylonian statecraft outlasted their political dominion. Archaeological discoveries in the 20th century have deepened our understanding of this transitional phase. Excavations at Nippur and Ur have uncovered administrative tablets dating to the final Kassite years, revealing a bureaucracy still functioning, albeit under strain. These texts show continued temple activity and land management even amid external invasion. This evidence suggests that Babylon's collapse was not instantaneous but gradual, a slow erosion of central power punctuated by catastrophic military events. The cultural memory of the Kassites and later Mesopotamian tradition was ambivalent. Some chronicles remembered them as legitimate restorers who had safeguarded Babylon's sanctity after earlier destructions. Others portrayed their fall as divine retribution for impiety or weakness. Neither view captures the full complexity of their rule. The Kassite dynasty's endurance, administrative sophistication, and capacity for cultural adaptation make it one of the most resilient regimes in ancient Mesopotamia. Their legacy was one of preservation rather than conquest, an era in which Babylon's identity as a center of civilization was not only maintained but strengthened. By the dawn of the 12th century BCE, Babylon stood at a crossroads. Its old dynasties were gone, its temples looted, and its international influence curtailed. Yet beneath the surface of decline lay the enduring structures that would allow the city to rise again. Over the following centuries, new rulers, Chaldeans, Assyrians, and later Neo-Babylonians, would draw upon the institutional foundations first solidified under the Kassites. The cycle of destruction and renewal, so characteristic of Mesopotamian history, was about to begin once more. The fall of the Kassite dynasty thus marks both an ending and a continuity. It closed the chapter of Babylon's Middle Kingdom and opened the path toward its eventual rebirth. In the next section, the narrative turns to this period of fragmentation and resurgence, the centuries that would reshape Babylon's destiny and set the stage for its final imperial flowering. The fall of the Kassite dynasty in the mid-12th century BC plunged Babylon into one of the most turbulent periods of its history. In the wake of Elamite invasion and internal disarray, the political order that had governed Mesopotamia for centuries disintegrated. For nearly 200 years, Babylon would experience what historians describe as the post-Kassite interregnum, an era defined by shifting power, nomadic incursions, and the gradual transformation of Mesopotamia's social and ethnic landscape. This was not a collapse into emptiness, but a profound reordering of civilization itself. Across the Near East, the great powers of the Late Bronze Age had fallen or were in retreat. The Hittite Empire disappeared from Anatolia, Egypt withdrew from its Asiatic provinces, and the Assyrian kingdom oscillated between expansion and contraction. In this fluid environment, new peoples, less centralized but more mobile, began to shape the political map. Chief among them were the Arameans, a confederation of tribal groups originating from the steppe lands west of the Euphrates. The Arameans first appear in Babylonian and Assyrian sources during the 12th century BCE, described not as a single nation but as loosely organized tribes moving through northern and central Mesopotamia. Their migration was part of a broader regional phenomenon, the dispersal of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples following the collapse of Bronze Age economies. The weakening of established borders allowed these groups to enter settled lands in search of pasture, trade, and security. In Babylonia, the absence of a strong central government made this process particularly rapid and far-reaching. The immediate aftermath of the Kassite collapse saw the emergence of short-lived dynasties. The so-called Second Dynasty of Isin, founded around 1150 BCE, attempted to re-establish native rule in Babylon. Kings such as Marduk-Kebedeheshu and Nebuchadnezzar I sought to restore order, reclaim temple treasures, and assert Babylonian independence from foreign powers. Nebuchadnezzar I, in particular, achieved temporary success. He defeated the Elamites and famously returned the statue of Marduk to Babylon, an act celebrated in later chronicles as a moment of divine restoration. For a time, it seemed that Babylon might recover its former prestige. Yet the recovery was fragile. The kingdom remained fragmented, its authority confined largely to the central Euphrates Valley. Beyond these core regions, the Arameans established themselves in increasing numbers. They founded semi-permanent settlements along rivers and trade routes, often blending with local populations. Some became farmers and herders. Others served as mercenaries or caravan leaders. Their influence gradually reshaped the demographic and cultural profile of Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence supports this transition. Across the northern and western plains, older urban centers declined, replaced by smaller, more dispersed settlements. Pottery styles shifted towards simpler, handmade forms associated with mobile groups. Inscriptions became rarer, reflecting both the contraction of bureaucratic institutions and the rise of oral rather than written administration among new communities. The Babylon that emerged from this era was thus smaller, more localized, and ethnically diverse. The Aramean presence introduced linguistic change as well. Over time, their language, Aramaic, a Semitic tongue closely related to Hebrew and Akkadian, spread across the region. By the first millennium BCE, it would become the lingua franca of the Near East, coexisting with and eventually superseding Akkadian in everyday use. This linguistic shift illustrates the broader transformation underway. Babylonian culture remained, but it was being reinterpreted through new populations and new modes of life. Politically, the centuries following the Kassite fall were marked by oscillation between revival and relapse. After the Isin dynasty's decline, Babylon fell again under foreign influence, particularly from Assyria. The Assyrian kings of the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, including Tiglath-Pileser I, conducted repeated campaigns into Babylonia. Their motives were partly defensive, to secure trade routes and buffer zones, and partly ideological, to assert control over the land of ancient prestige. Babylon, however, retained symbolic importance. Even when subjugated, it was treated not as a mere province, but as a sacred city, its temples and rituals respected by conquerors who sought divine legitimacy. Meanwhile, the Arameans continued to reshape Mesopotamia's frontier zones. Their settlements formed a patchwork of tribal polities, many of which would later evolve into small kingdoms such as Bit Yakin and Bit Adini. In southern Mesopotamia, the Chaldeans, another tribal confederation of related origin, began to appear. These groups, initially peripheral to Babylonian civilization, would eventually play central roles in its revival. Their adaptability to both nomadic and settled life allowed them to thrive amid instability, and over generations, many adopted Babylonian religion and governance. The long-term effect of Aramean infiltration was paradoxical. On one hand, it fragmented Babylonian authority and contributed to centuries of political weakness. On the other, it injected new vitality into the region's demographic and cultural mix. The blending of Aramean, Chaldean, and Babylonian elements would give rise to the society that later produced the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the last and most brilliant phase of Mesopotamian civilization. From an archaeological perspective, the interregnum represents a challenge of visibility. Few monumental inscriptions survive, and royal archives are scarce. What remains are traces, modest temples rebuilt atop older ruins, domestic structures scattered across the floodplain, and occasional cylinder seals bearing local names. Yet these fragments tell a story of endurance. Even amid loss and migration, The idea of Babylon as a city of gods, law, and learning persisted. The Temple of Marduk remained a focal point, its rites maintained by priestly families who preserved Babylonian religion through centuries of foreign domination. By the 10th century BCE, a new equilibrium began to form. The Assyrians re-emerged as dominant in the north, while Babylon, though diminished, stabilized under native and mixed dynasties. The Arameans had become part of the social fabric, their language widespread and their influence irreversible. The stage was set for the next great struggle in Mesopotamian history, the contest between Assyria's imperial ambitions and Babylon's enduring claim to spiritual primacy. By the early 10th century BCE, Babylon had re-emerged as a modest but persistent power amid a transformed Mesopotamia. The great Kassite Empire was long gone, and the region's once balanced political order had given way to a hierarchy dominated by Assyria in the north. While Babylon retained immense religious prestige, it no longer commanded the military or economic strength to rival its northern neighbor. For the next 4 centuries, Babylon's destiny would unfold in the shadow of Assyrian expansion, a complex relationship marked by rivalry, reverence, and reluctant coexistence. The Neo-Assyrian state began its resurgence around 900 BCE under kings such as Adad-nirari II and Ashurnasirpal II. Their campaigns restored Assyrian control over northern Mesopotamia, reasserted dominance over trade routes, and imposed tribute on neighboring states. Babylon lay within the sphere of these ambitions, yet Assyrian rulers approached it with caution. Conquest of Babylon carried risks. To dominate the city of Marduk without defiling it required political tact and religious legitimacy. In Mesopotamian thought, Babylon was not merely a city. It was the axis of divine order, the dwelling place of the gods, and the heart of sacred kingship. Any ruler who claimed authority over Mesopotamia needed Babylon's blessing to make that rule legitimate. Early Assyrian interventions therefore alternated between aggression and diplomacy. At times, Assyrian kings invaded Babylonia to quell rebellions or assert influence. At others, they sought alliance through marriage or religious ceremony. The historical record from this period, royal inscriptions, chronicles, and correspondence, reflects these shifting dynamics. The Babylonian chronicles describe cycles of warfare and reconciliation, of Assyrian rulers entering Babylon to perform rituals and later withdrawing to avoid unrest. The balance was delicate. Assyria could not afford to leave Babylon uncontrolled, yet could not afford to rule it harshly without risking divine disfavor. Within Babylon itself, power remained fragmented. Local dynasties arose intermittently, often with Assyrian support or acquiescence. Kings such as Nabu-shima-ukin-I and Nabu-apla-iddina, r. 888 to 855 BC, restored elements of Kassite governance and rebuilt key temples. Nabu-apla-iddina, in particular, is remembered for his efforts to revive Marduk's cult and restore the Es-Sagila temple complex, which had suffered from neglect and earlier wars. He issued a famous sun god tablet, recording a royal decree that reaffirmed temple land rights and religious endowments, a sign that even under foreign pressure, Babylonian kings continued to frame legitimacy through divine service and continuity. During this same period, the Aramean and Chaldean tribes, long established along the Euphrates and the southern marshes, became decisive actors in Babylonian politics. Many of them had settled permanently, building small towns and controlling fertile tracts of land. Some served as intermediaries between Babylon and Assyria, while others exploited the rivalry between the two powers to secure autonomy. Over time, these groups would produce leaders capable of claiming the Babylonian throne themselves. The seeds of the later Neo-Babylonian dynasty thus lay in the tribal confederations of this era. Assyrian expansion reached new heights under Shalmaneser III, r. 858 to 824 BCE, whose annals record campaigns that stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the Levant. Babylon appears frequently in these inscriptions, sometimes as ally, sometimes as adversary. In one campaign, Shalmaneser claims to have received tribute from Babylonian and Chaldean rulers. In another, he boasts of defeating rebellious southern tribes. The picture that emerges is one of fluctuating control, Assyria asserting dominance through periodic incursions but rarely imposing direct administration over Babylon itself. The situation grew more complex in the 8th century BCE, as Assyria transformed into a true empire under Tiglath-Pileser III, r. 745 to 727 BCE. It sought to consolidate Mesopotamia under centralized rule. Tiglath-Pileser introduced new administrative reforms, dividing conquered lands into provinces governed by loyal officials. When he campaigned in Babylonia, he adopted a dual strategy: military suppression of rebellious tribes, followed by gestures of conciliation toward the priesthood of Marduk. In 729 BCE, he crowned himself king of Babylon, not as conqueror, but as chosen ruler, and performed the Akitu, or New Year festival, symbolically affirming his legitimacy before the gods. This act demonstrates how deeply intertwined religion and politics had become in the Assyro-Babylonian relationship. His successors followed a similar pattern. Shalmaneser I and Sargon II maintained control through vassal kings, alternating between diplomacy and force. Sennacherib, however, broke this careful balance. In 689 BCE, after repeated rebellions led by Babylonian and Chaldean factions, he launched a devastating campaign against the city. His inscriptions describe the destruction of Babylon, the flooding of its temples, the razing of its walls, and the deportation of its inhabitants. The act shocked the ancient world. Even among Assyrians, it was seen as a violation of cosmic order. Subsequent kings, including Esarhaddon, sought to atone for the desecration. Esarhaddon rebuilt the city and restored Marduk's statue, declaring that divine wrath must be appeased. The event became a lasting symbol of both Babylon's vulnerability and its sanctity. Culturally, this era witnessed a dual legacy. On one hand, Assyrian dominance brought economic integration. Trade routes were reopened, and artisans, scribes, and scholars circulated between Nineveh, Calhu, and Babylon. On the other, Babylon remained the intellectual and spiritual center of Mesopotamia. Its astronomers continued to record celestial phenomena, its scribes preserved canonical texts, its temples sustained ritual traditions that even the Assyrian monarchs sought to emulate. The Enuma Anu Enlil astronomical compendium and later sections of the Enuma Elish creation epic were standardized during this period, reflecting Babylon's enduring role as the repository of sacred knowledge. By the early 7th century BCE, Babylon's relationship with Assyria had evolved into a complex coexistence. It was alternately a province, a partner, and a symbol, never entirely subdued, never fully free. The city's prestige remained unmatched, and every Assyrian ruler understood that Mesopotamian kingship, in its truest sense, required Babylonian sanction. This paradox, subjugation alongside reverence, defined the political theology of the region. The Assyrian shadow was long, but it also provided the conditions for Babylon's final rebirth. As Assyria overextended and internal strains mounted, Babylonian leaders, many of Chaldean descent, would seize the opportunity to reclaim autonomy. The city that had endured centuries of domination would soon rise again, not as a vassal, but as the heart of a new empire. By the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE, Babylon's centuries-long subordination to Assyria was reaching its breaking point. The city had endured cycles of destruction and reconstruction, of forced submission and symbolic restoration. Yet beneath this pattern of imperial dominance, new social and political forces were quietly forming in the southern reaches of Mesopotamia. From the marshlands of the lower Euphrates, a coalition of tribes, collectively known as the Chaldeans, began to emerge as both challengers and eventual successors to Assyrian power. Their rise would set the stage for Babylon's final and most resplendent age. The Chaldeans, or Kaldu as they appear in Assyrian records, were a Semitic-speaking people who had settled in the marshy lands near the Persian Gulf around the early 1st millennium BCE. Divided into tribal confederations, they lived among the older Aramean groups and established small, fortified towns along the Euphrates' southern channels. Their strategic position gave them access to both the agricultural heartland of Babylonia and the trade routes extending into Arabia and Elam. Over time, several Chaldean clans gained wealth through trade and local governance, integrating into the Babylonian cultural sphere while maintaining their own leadership structures. For Assyrian administrators, these tribes were both valuable and troublesome. They could serve as intermediaries in the south, but also as sources of rebellion. Assyrian annals from Tiglath-Pileser III to Sennacherib list repeated campaigns against Chaldean leaders, Merodach-Baladan, Shuzabu, and others, who sought to assert independence. Yet each time, the Assyrian victory proved temporary. The vast floodplains and marshes offered natural defense, allowing resistance to persist even after defeats. The most significant of these leaders was Merodach-Baladan II, Marduk-Kapladina II, a Chaldean chieftain of the Bit-Yakin tribe. He first rose to prominence in the late 8th century BCE, seizing control of Babylon during the turbulence following Shalmaneser V's death. In 722 BCE, as Sargon II consolidated power in Assyria, Merodach-Baladan proclaimed himself king of Babylon, the first Chaldean to do so, and was recognized by the Babylonian priesthood. His accession was not merely a political coup. It symbolized a restoration of native rule after decades of foreign dominance. Merodach-Baladan skillfully invoked Marduk's favor, portraying himself as the protector of Babylonian tradition against Assyrian intrusion. For a decade, he managed to maintain this fragile independence. He cultivated alliances with Elam to the east and with smaller states along the Persian Gulf. He sponsored temple restorations, public works, and religious ceremonies to secure legitimacy. Assyrian records, however, depict him as a usurper and rebel, emphasizing the constant tension between Babylonian autonomy and Assyrian imperial order. In 710 BCE, Sargon II invaded Babylonia, defeating Merodach-Baladan and reclaiming the city. Yet even in exile, the Chaldean leader continued to challenge Assyrian control, rallying southern tribes, and briefly retaking Babylon again after Sargon's death. Merodach-Baladan's efforts ultimately failed to create a lasting state, but his legacy was profound. He demonstrated that Babylonian kingship could once again emerge from within the southern population, independent of Assyrian appointment. His invocation of divine legitimacy and his use of diplomacy with Elam and other powers provided a model for future rulers. Most importantly, he revealed that Assyria, despite its military superiority, could not permanently suppress the southern provinces without undermining its own stability. In the decades that followed, Assyria oscillated between repression and appeasement. Kings such as Esarhaddon, r. 681 to 669 BCE, and Ashurbanipal, r. 669 to 631 BCE, alternately rebuilt Babylon and imposed vassal rulers. Esarhaddon, seeking to atone for his father Sennacherib's destruction of the city, initiated a massive reconstruction effort, restoring temples, walls, and canals. Ashurbanipal, in turn, installed his brother Shamash-Shum-Ukin as vassal king of Babylon, attempting to stabilize the dual monarchy through familial ties. This experiment ended in catastrophe. In 652 BCE, Shamash-Shum-Ukin rebelled against Assyrian authority, uniting Elamites, Chaldeans, and Arabs in a vast coalition. After a brutal siege lasting several years, Babylon fell once more, its rebellion crushed, and its independence extinguished for the time being. Yet Assyria's dominance was nearing its end. The empire, overstretched and weakened by internal strife, began to fragment after Ashurbanipal's death. Peripheral provinces rebelled, subject peoples sought autonomy, and rival claimants divided the throne. It was in this vacuum that a new Chaldean leader, Nabopolassar, emerged. Nabopolasser's origins are obscure, but most sources agree that he hailed from a Chaldean background, likely linked to the same tribal confederations that had once followed Merodach-Baladan. Around 626 BCE, amid Assyrian civil war, Nabopolassar declared himself king of Babylon. His timing was precise. Assyria was distracted by internal rivalries, and the Babylonian priesthood, weary of foreign rule, welcomed a native restorer. Within a few years, Nabopolassar consolidated control over southern Mesopotamia, re-established administrative stability, and revived Babylon's traditional institutions. His reign marked the true foundation of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the last great Mesopotamian dynasty. Crucially, Nabopolassar understood the geopolitical landscape of his time. To the east, the Medes were rising under King Cyaxares, while remnants of Assyria still held strongholds such as Nineveh and Haran. Through a series of strategic alliances, Nabopolassar coordinated with the Medes to dismantle Assyrian power systematically. In 612 BCE, their combined forces captured and destroyed Nineveh, a symbolic reversal of centuries of domination. The land of Ashur was now divided, and Babylon, once subjugated, emerged as the dominant heir to Mesopotamia's imperial legacy. The Chaldean ascendance was not merely a political triumph, but a cultural and ideological restoration. Under Nabopolassar, Babylon reclaimed its ancient role as the axis of kingship and divine order. The rebuilding of temples, the restoration of canal systems, and the revival of the Akitu festival all signaled a deliberate return to continuity. For the first time in nearly a millennium, Babylon's rulers no longer operated in the shadow of a northern overlord. The rise of the Chaldean dynasty thus represents a critical inflection in Mesopotamian history, the transition from foreign subjugation to native resurgence, from imperial dependency to self-determination. It also foreshadowed the remarkable reign of Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, whose leadership would transform Babylon into one of the most renowned capitals of the ancient world. When Nabopolassar died in 605 BCE, his son Nebuchadnezzar II ascended the throne of Babylon. His reign, which lasted more than 4 decades, marked the pinnacle of Babylonian power in the ancient world. Under his leadership, Babylon became the unrivaled political, economic, and cultural center of the Near East. What had begun under Nabopolassar as a regional resurgence matured into a true imperial system, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Levant. Nebuchadnezzar's rule represented not only territorial conquest, but also monumental statecraft, a deliberate fusion of military dominance, architectural grandeur, and administrative precision that defined the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar's rise to power was preceded by a decisive military victory. As crown prince, he had commanded Babylonian forces against the remnants of Assyria and their Egyptian allies. In 605 BCE, at the Battle of Carchemish, his army decisively defeated the Egyptian expedition led by Pharaoh Necho II, eliminating Egypt's influence in the Near East. This victory established Babylon as the successor to Assyria's former domains, including Syria, Phoenicia, and Judah. When his father died soon after, Nebuchadnezzar returned to Babylon to claim the throne, already acclaimed as a military genius and legitimate heir to the restored empire. The first decade of his reign was spent consolidating this vast inheritance. Campaigns in the west secured vassal states that had once belonged to Assyria. Nebuchadnezzar imposed tribute, appointed governors, and rebuilt fortresses along the Euphrates. Archaeological and textual evidence, such as the Babylonian chronicles, record yearly campaigns into the Levant, including sieges of rebellious cities like Ashkelon and Jerusalem. In 597 BCE and again in 587 BCE, he captured Jerusalem, deposed its kings, and deported much of the Judean elite to Babylon, an event remembered in later tradition as the Babylonian exile. These deportations, though severe, were consistent with Mesopotamian imperial policy. Conquered populations were relocated to integrate labor and prevent further insurrection. The Judeans, in turn, contributed to Babylon's intellectual and economic life, leaving behind one of history's most influential cultural interactions between conqueror and captive. Nebuchadnezzar's administration combined efficiency with deep continuity. He maintained the bureaucratic systems inherited from previous Mesopotamian empires, but expanded their scale. Provincial governors, often drawn from local elites, reported directly to the royal court. Tribute and agricultural output were recorded in cuneiform tablets, thousands of which have survived, providing an extraordinary record of imperial logistics. The state oversaw the management of irrigation, canal maintenance, and grain distribution, vital undertakings in a land dependent on controlled water systems. This network of administrative control allowed Babylon to sustain both its growing population and its ambitious construction projects. For Nebuchadnezzar, the prosperity of the state was inseparable from the splendor of its capital. His reign produced one of the most extensive urban rebuilding programs in ancient history. Nearly every surviving brick from the city's ruins bears his inscription, affirming his devotion to Marduk and his role as restorer of Babylon's greatness. The city's walls, palaces, and temples were rebuilt or expanded on an unprecedented scale. Central to this transformation was the processional way, a grand avenue leading through the Ishtar Gate, a structure adorned with glazed blue bricks and reliefs of bulls and dragons symbolizing the gods Adad and Marduk. The gate, reconstructed in modern times from excavated fragments, remains one of the most iconic examples of Mesopotamian architecture. Within the city, the Etemenanke ziggurat, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose as the towering centerpiece of Marduk's temple complex. Ancient accounts describe it as reaching several stories high, its terraces visible from miles across the plain. This structure likely inspired later traditions, such as the biblical Tower of Babel. Together with the Es-Sagila Temple, the ziggurat formed the spiritual heart of Babylon, where the annual Akitu festival reaffirmed the divine order of kingship. Each new year, the statue of Marduk was paraded along the processional way, symbolically renewing the bond between God and ruler. Through these ceremonies, Nebuchadnezzar legitimized his reign not merely as a military conqueror, but as a divinely appointed guardian of cosmic balance. Beyond the walls, Babylon's infrastructure reflected careful planning. Nebuchadnezzar restored and extended the royal canal system, connecting the Euphrates to agricultural zones and enabling reliable grain transport. He commissioned new roads, bridges, and fortifications, including the so-called Median Wall, a defensive line protecting the empire's northern frontier. These projects not only enhanced security, but also stimulated economic integration across Mesopotamia. Trade flourished. Merchants from Arabia, Phoenicia, and Anatolia brought luxury goods, while Babylonian artisans exported textiles, metalwork, and ceramics renowned for their craftsmanship. While Babylon's architecture and administration were monumental, the city's cultural life was equally vibrant. The empire became a magnet for scholars, priests, and craftsmen from across the region. Astronomers and mathematicians refined celestial observations and developed methods for predicting planetary motion. These Babylonian astronomical records, inscribed on clay tablets, would later influence Hellenistic and even modern science. Scribal schools preserved ancient Sumerian and Akkadian texts, ensuring continuity with earlier civilizations. Under Nebuchadnezzar's patronage, the intellectual and religious institutions of Babylon reached a maturity that positioned the city as the intellectual capital of the ancient Near East. Ancient traditions later ascribed to Nebuchadnezzar the creation of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Although direct archaeological evidence remains debated, classical sources describe terraced gardens irrigated by mechanical means, symbolizing the wealth and ingenuity of Babylonian engineering. Whether literal or idealized, the legend reflects the enduring association of Nebuchadnezzar's reign with beauty, abundance, and architectural mastery. By the end of his rule, Babylon had become not only the strongest empire in the region, but also a symbol of civilization itself, a synthesis of military power, religious devotion, and urban magnificence. The empire's reach extended from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, yet its strength lay less in conquest than in administration and cultural cohesion. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was a world where divine order and imperial policy were one and the same, where monumental architecture expressed both spiritual piety and political stability. When Nebuchadnezzar died around 562 BCE, he left behind an empire at its zenith, secure, prosperous, and monumental. Yet the vast resources required to maintain such splendor would soon become a burden to his successors. The unity he achieved through discipline and devotion would prove difficult to sustain without his leadership. The death of Nebuchadnezzar II in 562 BC marked the close of Babylon's most brilliant era. Under his rule, The empire had reached unparalleled levels of stability, prosperity, and prestige. Yet the very structures that had supported its success, vast bureaucracy, central authority, and complex economic dependencies, also made it vulnerable. In the decades following his death, a series of short-lived and often ineffective rulers presided over the gradual weakening of the Neo-Babylonian state. The empire that had once dominated the Near East began to fragment internally even as external threats grew along its borders. Nebuchadnezzar's immediate successor was his son, Marduk, known in biblical tradition as Evil Merodach, who ruled from 562 to 560 BCE. Contemporary sources provide limited insight into his reign, but later Babylonian and Jewish texts suggest that his rule was marked by attempts at reconciliation and reform. He is best known for releasing the captive Judean king Jehoiakim from prison, an act recorded in both Babylonian tablets and biblical accounts. This gesture, while symbolic, reflected a broader effort to stabilize relations with the empire's diverse subject peoples. However, Marduk lacked his father's authority and administrative discipline. His reign ended abruptly after 2 years, likely through a palace coup led by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar. Neriglissar, r. 560 to 556 BCE, had served as a high-ranking officer and was married to one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, which lent him partial legitimacy. His rule emphasized infrastructure and commerce. Cuneiform records suggest that he initiated building projects and sought to secure trade routes along the Mediterranean coast, particularly in Phoenicia. Babylonian merchants had become increasingly involved in long-distance trade, importing cedar, metals, and luxury goods, and maintaining stability in these western territories was vital. Despite his competence, Neriglissar's reign was brief. He died after 4 years, leaving the throne to his young son, Marduk, whose rule lasted only a few months before he was overthrown by a faction of court officials. The ensuing turmoil brought to power a man who would be Babylon's last significant ruler, Nabonidus, r. 556 to 539 BCE. His ascent marked a striking departure from dynastic tradition. Nabonidus was not of royal blood and may have been a court official or military commander before seizing the throne. His reign introduced a distinctive and, ultimately, controversial vision for Babylonian kingship, one that combined piety, antiquarian interest, and administrative innovation with policies that alienated both the priesthood and sections of the population. Nabonidus was deeply religious, but his devotion centered not on Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, but on the moon god Sin, whose principal temples were located in Haran and Uar. Early in his reign, he began restoring ancient shrines dedicated to Sin and other deities neglected over centuries. His inscriptions often emphasize his role as a restorer of ancient sanctuaries and a preserver of historical inscriptions, suggesting an intellectual fascination with Mesopotamia's deep past. Yet his preference for Sin over Marduk disrupted the delicate balance between royal power and Babylon's priesthood. The Esagila Temple's priests, guardians of Marduk's cult, viewed his actions as impious, especially when Nabonidus delayed or neglected the Akitu, New Year, festival, the central ritual affirming the king's divine mandate. Around 553 BCE, Nabonidus made a decision that would further strain his rule. He departed Babylon and established a prolonged residence in Tama, an oasis city in northwestern Arabia. The reasons remain debated. Some sources suggest he sought to control Arabian trade routes. Others imply religious retreat or political exile. Whatever the cause, the effect was profound. For nearly a decade, the empire was governed in his absence by his son Belshazzar, acting as regent. Administrative continuity persisted, but the absence of the king during the most sacred rituals was viewed as a sign of cosmic disorder. The priesthood, alienated and politically marginalized, began to favor alternative claimants to legitimacy. Despite internal tension, the empire remained outwardly stable for much of Nabonidus's reign. Trade continued, Babylon retained its grandeur, and the empire's fortifications remained intact. Yet beneath the surface, loyalty was eroding, not only among the priests but also among subject provinces. Meanwhile, a formidable new power was rising in the east. The Persian Empire, under the leadership of Cyrus II of Anshan, soon to be known as Cyrus the Great. By uniting the Medes and Persians and absorbing former Assyrian territories, Cyrus created a state that rivaled Babylon in both scale and ambition. As Cyrus advanced westward, Nabonidus's unpopularity within Babylon became a critical weakness. When the Persian army reached Mesopotamia in 539 BCE, resistance was limited. Contemporary records such as the Cyrus Cylinder describe the conquest as almost bloodless. The city surrendered without destruction, and Cyrus entered Babylon to perform the Akitu rituals, presenting himself as the legitimate protector of Marduk's temple. For many Babylonians, weary of Nabonidus's neglect and his religious deviations, the Persian takeover appeared as a restoration of divine order rather than an invasion. Nabonidus was captured and exiled. Belshazzar was killed in the fighting near Opis. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, after less than a century of supremacy, came to an end. In retrospect, the decline of Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar's reign was less a sudden collapse than a slow unraveling. The empire's vast bureaucracy, though effective, required a strong central figure to sustain its cohesion. Its economy, reliant on monumental construction and administrative control, faltered without consistent leadership. Religious discord further undermined legitimacy, while new geopolitical forces, especially Persia, reshaped the balance of power in the Near East. Babylon's fall in 539 BCE was thus both an endpoint and a transformation. Its political autonomy ended, but its cultural and intellectual legacy would endure within the Persian imperial framework. When Cyrus II, known to history as Cyrus the Great, entered Babylon in October 539 BCE, the event marked not the destruction of a civilization but its transformation. The conquest of Babylon by the Persians ended Mesopotamian political independence, yet it did not extinguish Babylon's cultural, religious, or administrative importance. In fact, under Persian rule, the city remained one of the most vital centers of the ancient world, a hub of governance, scholarship, and ritual continuity. The transition from Neo-Babylonian to Achaemenid control was unusually smooth, reflecting both Cyrus's pragmatic policy and Babylon's enduring prestige. Contemporary sources offer a remarkably detailed view of this transition. Chief among them is the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay inscription often regarded as the earliest declaration of royal tolerance. Written in traditional Akkadian cuneiform, it presents Cyrus as a liberator rather than a conqueror. It claims that Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, had abandoned the impious Nabonidus and chosen Cyrus to restore justice and order. The text describes how Cyrus entered the city peacefully, respected its sanctuaries, and allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands. While this inscription is undoubtedly propagandistic, it reflects the deliberate effort to align Persian rule with Babylonian religious and cultural norms. Rather than imposing a new system, Cyrus adopted the symbolism and legitimacy of Babylonian kingship. The early Persian rulers maintained Babylon as one of the empire's four principal capitals, alongside Susa, Ecbatana, and Persepolis. Administrative continuity was striking. Babylonian scribes continued to record official documents in cuneiform on clay tablets, particularly in economic and legal contexts. Thousands of such tablets, now known as the Marashu archives and others, survive from the Persian period, detailing transactions, land leases, and taxation under imperial oversight. The Achaemenid satraps, provincial governors, relied on local bureaucrats who operated within the long-established Babylonian administrative tradition. In this respect, the Persian conquest represented not an overthrow of institutions, but their integration into a larger imperial framework. Economically, Babylon flourished under Persian rule. The empire's vast territorial expanse opened new trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to the eastern Iranian plateau, Central Asia, and even the Indus Valley. The fertile alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia continued to produce surplus grain, dates, and textiles, which supplied both local markets and imperial logistics. The Persians, skilled administrators themselves, improved infrastructure by maintaining canals and road systems, facilitating communication between Babylon and other centers of governance. The famed Royal Road, extending from Sardis to Susa, linked Western Asia Minor to Mesopotamia, integrating Babylon into the heart of the Achaemenid economic network. Religiously, Babylon retained its central role. The cult of Marduk and the great Esagila temple remained active, supported by royal endowments. Persian kings regularly participated, or at least symbolically endorsed, the Akitu, New Year, festival, reaffirming the divine order in accordance with Babylonian custom. Cyrus and his successors, including Darius I and Xerxes I, issued inscriptions affirming their respect for the gods of Babylon. In doing so, they projected themselves as legitimate heirs to the long Mesopotamian tradition of sacred kingship. The empire's religious policy, while pragmatic, reflected an understanding that Babylon's priesthood held immense ideological influence across the Near East. However, the relationship between Babylon and its Persian overlords was not without strain. After Cyrus's death, the city remained loyal under Cambyses II and Darius I, but tensions flared during the early 5th century BC. When Darius seized the throne in 522 BC amid internal revolts, two Babylonian pretenders, Nidintabel and Araka, briefly declared themselves kings, adopting the ancient royal title of Nebuchadnezzar. These uprisings were swiftly suppressed, yet they revealed Babylon's lingering sense of its own imperial identity. Darius commemorated his victory in the Behistun inscription, written in 3 languages, as proof of his legitimacy and divine favor. Despite these episodes, Babylon remained a major provincial center throughout his reign. A more consequential shift occurred under Xerxes I, r. 486 to 465 BCE. Following revolts in Babylon around 482 BCE, Xerxes enacted punitive measures that marked a turning point in Persian policy. According to later Greek and Babylonian sources, he removed the statue of Marduk from the Esagila temple, a symbolic act suggesting the loss of Babylon's divine centrality. Some ancient accounts even allege that parts of the city were damaged or its fortifications dismantled, though archaeological evidence for widespread destruction is limited. What is clearer is that after Xerxes, Babylon's religious prestige declined relative to its earlier status. The Persian administration gradually shifted its focus towards Susa and Persepolis, which became the ceremonial capitals of the empire. Yet Babylon's urban and intellectual vitality endured. The city continued to be inhabited and active throughout the Achaemenid period. Astronomers working in Babylonian temples maintained systematic observations of celestial phenomena, producing some of the most sophisticated astronomical records in the ancient world. These astronomical diaries, spanning centuries, meticulously tracked lunar and planetary movements, eclipses, and weather, data that later informed Greek and Hellenistic astronomy. Scholars continued to copy and study classical Sumerian and Akkadian texts, preserving a tradition of learning that had begun more than 2 millennia earlier. The persistence of this scholarly culture underscores the unique adaptability of Babylonian civilization. Even as political sovereignty passed from one empire to another, its intellectual institutions remained rooted in temple life and scribal education. The Persian rulers, recognizing the utility of this expertise, supported it indirectly through temple patronage and administrative demand for trained scribes. Thus, Babylon under the Persians became both a provincial capital and a center of ancient knowledge, a place where imperial governance and traditional scholarship coexisted in relative harmony. By the late 5th century BCE, Babylon's population had begun to decline as newer capitals drew resources and prestige away. Yet its symbolic significance never disappeared. For the Persians, Babylon represented the ideal of cosmic order, the notion that rightful kingship depended on divine sanction and just governance. This concept, inherited and adapted from Mesopotamian theology, would echo through later imperial ideologies, including those of Alexander the Great and the Seleucid kings who followed. When Alexander III of Macedon, known as Alexander the Great, entered Babylon in October 331 BC, he was not simply a conqueror taking a city. He was inheriting one of the deepest legacies of civilization. For over 2 millennia, Babylon had stood as a symbol of imperial authority and intellectual refinement. Its conquest by Alexander marked both an end and a new beginning. the fusion of Greek and Mesopotamian worlds. This convergence would transform not only Babylon itself, but the trajectory of Western and Near Eastern history. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire came swiftly after Alexander's victory at Gaugamela, northeast of modern Mosul. There, on open terrain ideal for cavalry maneuver, the Macedonian forces shattered the army of Darius III, the last Persian king. Babylon, the richest and most renowned city of Mesopotamia, opened its gates without resistance. Ancient sources such as Arrian, Curtius Rufus, and Diodorus Siculus describe a ceremonial entry marked by order rather than destruction, a deliberate echo of Cyrus the Great's peaceful entry nearly 2 centuries earlier. Alexander's restraint was strategic. He sought to legitimize his rule not through fear, but through continuity with the past. Upon his arrival, Alexander presented himself not as an invader, but as a rightful successor to Babylonian kingship. He made offerings at the Sagila temple to Marduk, participating in rituals that had crowned rulers since Hammurabi's time. This act was more than symbolic. It was an assertion that divine favor now rested with him. By adopting the title King of Babylon and later King of Asia, Alexander bound his conquests to an ancient lineage that extended back to Sumer and Akkad. His respect for Babylon's traditions was not merely cultural diplomacy, but a calculated political gesture to stabilize his newly acquired empire. For the Babylonians, Alexander's arrival brought cautious optimism. The Persian rulers, especially Xerxes, had diminished Babylon's prominence. Alexander's interest in restoring the city's temples and infrastructure suggested a potential revival. He ordered repairs to the Sagila and the Etemenanki, the towering ziggurat known in later tradition as the Tower of Babel. Archaeological evidence indicates that the ziggurat had fallen into disrepair by this time, and Alexander's engineers began clearing debris and preparing for reconstruction. Although the project was never completed, it symbolized an attempt to reconnect the present with the city's monumental past. Administratively, Babylon became the center of Alexander's empire in the east. From here he issued decrees, coordinated campaigns, and received emissaries from across Asia. The city's strategic location, midway between the Mediterranean and the Iranian plateau, made it an ideal capital for a world empire stretching from Greece to India. Babylon's wealth, archives, and logistical infrastructure provided the backbone of Alexander's Eastern administration. Greek and Macedonian officials worked alongside local scribes who continued to write in Akkadian and Aramaic, creating one of history's first multicultural bureaucracies. The city also became a melting pot of peoples and ideas. Veterans from Macedonia and Greece mingled with Persian nobles, Babylonian priests, and scholars. Greek curiosity about Mesopotamian science flourished. Babylonian astronomers, whose records extended back centuries, shared their celestial data with Alexander's intellectual circle. These exchanges helped lay the groundwork for Hellenistic astronomy, influencing later thinkers such as Hipparchus and Ptolemy. The Greek fascination with Babylonian knowledge, particularly astrology and mathematics, reflected a broader cultural synthesis that would define the Hellenistic age. Yet Alexander's stay in Babylon also revealed the fragility of empire. In 323 BCE, after years of relentless campaigning, he returned to the city from India, physically weakened but still consumed by grand plans. Ancient sources record his ambition to make Babylon the administrative heart of his unified world. He ordered new harbors dug along the Euphrates and planned to expand irrigation systems to revitalize the region's economy. But these visions were cut short. In June 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill and died in the royal palace of Babylon, likely from fever or infection. His death at just 32 years old, in the world's oldest imperial capital, symbolized both the culmination and the collapse of his empire. In the days following his death, Babylon became the epicenter of crisis. His generals, later known as the Diadochi, convened to determine succession. The resulting partition of Babylon divided Alexander's vast territories among competing commanders. Seleucus I Nicator received control of Mesopotamia, while other regions were assigned to Ptolemy, Antigonus, and Lysimachus. This partition, negotiated within Babylon's walls, inaugurated the Hellenistic age, a period when Greek political structures fused with Near Eastern traditions to form new hybrid civilizations. The Seleucid dynasty, which emerged from this division, would later make Babylon one of its early administrative centers. Seleucus I and his successors recognized its symbolic value but gradually shifted focus to Seleucia the Tigris, a new city founded around 305 BCE that embodied Hellenistic urban design. As Seleucia rose, Babylon's importance waned, but its influence persisted in the region's intellectual and religious life. The city's scholars continued to work within temple precincts, preserving cuneiform learning even as Greek became the language of governance. Alexander's death in Babylon marked a profound historical juncture. It was the last moment when the city stood at the heart of a world empire. From Sumerian city-states to Akkadian monarchs, from Hammurabi's law code to Nebuchadnezzar's splendor, Babylon had served as the axis of Mesopotamian civilization. Under Alexander, that legacy briefly merged with the ambitions of the classical world, creating a bridge between the ancient East and the emerging West. Though the Hellenistic rulers who followed would build new capitals and adopt new forms of kingship, the intellectual and administrative models that shaped their governance owed much to Babylon's enduring example. In a broader sense, Alexander's Babylonian interlude exemplified the city's remarkable adaptability. Each conqueror, whether Assyrian, Persian, or Macedonian, had recognized the symbolic authority Babylon commanded. The continuity of its rituals, archives, and priesthood ensured that even under foreign domination, Babylon remained an indispensable center of legitimacy. The Greek historians who chronicled these events often described Babylon as immense and ancient, a city that seemed to exist outside of time, a perception that would echo through Western thought for centuries. In the century following Alexander's death, Babylon's long role as the heart of Mesopotamian civilization entered its final transformation. The Seleucid Empire, founded by Seleucus I Nicator around 312 BCE, inherited both the eastern territories of Alexander's conquests and the challenge of ruling them effectively. Though Seleucus initially governed from Babylon, his decision to construct a new capital, Seleucia the Tigris, marked the beginning of Babylon's irreversible decline. Yet this shift also demonstrated the continuity of its legacy, for the administrative and urban ideals that defined Seleucia were rooted in Babylonian precedent. When Seleucus first gained control of Mesopotamia, Babylon was still a populous and functioning city, though centuries of shifting river courses and overexploitation of the land had begun to affect its infrastructure. The Seleucid rulers, trained in Greek political traditions but ruling a deeply Mesopotamian landscape, sought to merge the two worlds. Babylon's central location and symbolic prestige made it an ideal starting point. Seleucus and his son Antiochus I maintained the Babylonian priesthoods, continued sacrifices to Marduk, and even used traditional royal titles and inscriptions. Greek coins from this period depict local deities alongside Hellenistic motifs, a deliberate blending of cultural symbols designed to legitimize Seleucid rule across diverse populations. However, practical governance favored change. By the early 3rd century BCE, Seleucus had founded Seleucia the Tigris, approximately 60 kilometers north of Babylon, on the opposite riverbank. This new city was conceived as a cosmopolitan hub, a planned urban center reflecting Greek architectural order and administrative efficiency. Wide avenues, organized districts, and a Greek-style agora contrasted with Babylon's organic, labyrinthine layout. Yet the underlying logic of Seleucia's design, proximity to waterways, reliance on canal systems, and the presence of a central temple complex, mirrored the urban principles developed in Mesopotamia thousands of years earlier. The Seleucid capital thus represented both innovation and inheritance. Economically, Seleucia's rise came at Babylon's expense. The new city rapidly attracted merchants, artisans, and administrators, benefiting from its position on the navigable stretch of the Tigris, which connected it directly to the Persian Gulf and the broader Hellenistic trade network. Babylon, increasingly bypassed by these commercial routes, entered a period of gradual depopulation. Cuneiform tablets from the late 3rd century BCE record fewer transactions and temple donations, suggesting declining activity in traditional institutions. Nevertheless, Babylon retained religious significance for some time. Temple records show ongoing rituals and astronomical observations well into the 2nd century BCE. The Hellenization of Mesopotamia under the Seleucids was neither abrupt nor uniform. Greek settlers introduced new forms of civic life, language, and art, but the persistence of Babylonian scholarly traditions remained striking. Priest astronomers continued to maintain observatories, compiling celestial diaries that bridged ancient methods with new influences. Indeed, some of the last known cuneiform tablets, dating to around 100 BCE, come from Babylonian temples under Seleucid and Parthian rule. These documents record planetary phenomena, eclipses, and ritual calendars, demonstrating that the intellectual flame kindled in Sumerian times still burned, even as the city itself faded. Politically, Babylon's role diminished as Seleucia and later Antioch became the primary centers of power. Seleucid kings rarely resided in Babylon, visiting mainly for ceremonial purposes. Administrative archives show that officials increasingly wrote in Greek or Aramaic rather than Akkadian, reflecting the region's integration into a Hellenistic cultural framework. The shift was not only linguistic but conceptual. Governance now operated through Greek-style municipal institutions rather than the temple-centered bureaucracy that had defined Mesopotamian administration for millennia. The archaeological record from this period reveals both continuity and abandonment. Excavations at Babylon show modest occupation layers from the Hellenistic period, interspersed with signs of neglect, crumbling walls, silted canals, and repurposed structures. Some portions of the city, including the Great Etemenanke ziggurat, appear to have been used as sources of building material for nearby settlements. Yet temples such as the Asagila continued to receive offerings into the 2nd century BCE, indicating that religious life persisted even as urban vitality waned. For local inhabitants, Babylon remained sacred ground, a living link to divine order and ancestral identity. The intellectual climate of Seleucid Mesopotamia was remarkably dynamic. Greek philosophical curiosity intersected with Babylonian empirical observation. In astronomy, Babylonian mathematical models of planetary motion influenced emerging Greek theories of the heavens. Scholars such as Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 BCE, exemplified this synthesis. His Babyloniaca, a history of Mesopotamia from creation to his own time, introduced Greek audiences to Babylonian cosmology and chronology. Though only fragments survive, his work demonstrates how local scholars reinterpreted their traditions within the Hellenistic intellectual world. Berossus's writings also underscore a crucial transformation, the shift from Babylon as a living capital to Babylon as an idea, a repository of memory and scholarship. As Seleucia grew, Babylon became a site of pilgrimage and reflection rather than administration. The ancient temples remained active not because they held political power, but because they symbolized cultural continuity in an era of change. Even as Greek settlers built gymnasia and theaters, the Mesopotamian scribes continued to press their wedge-shaped marks into clay, upholding a tradition that had endured for over 3,000 years. By the late 2nd century BCE, Babylon's decline had become irreversible. Seleucid control weakened under pressure from the Parthians, a rising Iranian power from the northeast. As the Seleucids lost territory and cohesion, the region around Babylon became a contested frontier. Yet even in its final centuries, Babylon never disappeared completely. Travelers and geographers of the Hellenistic world continued to speak of its grandeur, a city of ancient kings, vast walls, and vanished glory. To the Greeks, Babylon represented both the marvels of the East and the impermanence of empire. In retrospect, the Seleucid transformation was both an end and a beginning. The physical city of Babylon diminished, but its administrative, scientific, and ideological legacies lived on through Seleucia and the broader Hellenistic world. The idea that an empire could govern through structured bureaucracy, urban planning, and cultural pluralism, principles pioneered in Mesopotamia, found new life in the Seleucid system and later in Roman and Persian governance. Babylon's decline, therefore, was not a disappearance but a diffusion of influence. By the time the Parthian Empire rose to prominence in the mid-2nd century BCE, Babylon had already lost much of its former grandeur. Once the beating heart of Mesopotamian civilization, it now stood as a fragment of its own history, inhabited, but diminished, revered, yet largely abandoned to time. Under Parthian rule, Babylon's final centuries unfolded quietly, defined not by conquest or rebuilding, but by gradual decline, scholarly persistence, and the slow erosion of its place in the political world. The Parthians, an Iranian people from the region of Parthava, northeastern Iran, established their empire around 247 BCE, gradually seizing territories from the weakening Seleucid dynasty. By approximately 141 BCE, they had taken control of Mesopotamia, incorporating Babylon into their vast dominion. The Parthian administrative system was decentralized, favoring regional autonomy and local governance. In this respect, Babylon's temples and surviving priesthoods were allowed to continue functioning, but the city no longer held the strategic or economic value it once had. The Parthians made Ctesiphon, located across the Tigris from Seleucia, their imperial capital, further diverting attention and resources from ancient Babylon. Archaeological and textual evidence from this period is limited but telling. The last datable cuneiform tablets from Babylon belong to the early 1st century BCE, indicating that scribal traditions persisted remarkably late. These tablets, written in Akkadian, include astronomical diaries, ritual records, and business documents, showing that a small scholarly community remained active within the temples. Their survival reflects the extraordinary longevity of Mesopotamian intellectual life, a continuum of record-keeping and observation that had begun more than 3,000 years earlier. Yet these final texts also mark the end of an era. After their production ceased, the cuneiform script itself fell into disuse, its meaning forgotten for nearly 2 millennia. Cultural continuity was maintained chiefly through religion. The Esagila Temple of Marduk, though reduced in scale and resources, remained a functioning sanctuary into the early Parthian centuries. Rituals associated with the Babylonian New Year festival, Akitu, may still have been performed, albeit in simplified form. Greek and later Roman sources describe Babylon during this time as largely depopulated, with its once mighty ziggurat, the Etemenanke, already in ruins. Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, observed that Babylon had become deserted and that nothing remains but the walls. His account, though somewhat exaggerated, captures the symbolic sense of loss that surrounded the city's decline. Economically, Babylon's decay was linked to environmental change and shifting trade patterns. The Euphrates River had gradually altered its course, leaving sections of the city without reliable water access. Agricultural productivity in the surrounding plains diminished, reducing the wealth that had once supported the temples and population. Moreover, new trade routes favored Ctesiphon and Seleucia, where the Parthian kings concentrated their administrative and commercial activity. As caravans and river traffic bypassed Babylon, its population dispersed to nearby settlements or the newer urban centers along the Tigris. Despite its physical deterioration, Babylon's reputation endured. For the Parthians, the city retained immense symbolic importance. Royal inscriptions and coinage occasionally invoked Babylonian imagery, linking their rule to the region's ancient imperial heritage. In particular, the title of King of Kings, used by Parthian monarchs, echoed the Mesopotamian conception of universal sovereignty, a title that had once been associated with Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar. Even in neglect, Babylon remained a touchstone for legitimacy, a reminder that true kingship was measured not only by conquest, but by continuity with the civilizations of old. The encounter between Greek and Mesopotamian intellectual traditions also persisted, though now largely through secondary transmission. Babylonian astronomical methods, once maintained in the temples, influenced Hellenistic and later Greco-Roman astronomy via scholars who had studied in Mesopotamia during the Seleucid era. The mathematical models of lunar and planetary motion derived from Babylonian data formed the foundation for the theories later developed in Alexandria. Thus, even as the city itself faded, its intellectual heritage traveled westward, becoming part of the scientific tradition that would eventually shape medieval and modern astronomy. By the 1st century CE, Babylon was effectively a ruin. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History, described it as a place of great renown and ancient memory, but devoid of life. Travelers spoke of scattered villages amid the remnants of massive walls, canals choked with silt, and the desolate outlines of temples that once touched the sky. Yet, even in this desolation, Babylon's name carried extraordinary weight, evoking, for later civilizations, the idea of both human achievement and moral decline. This dual image, later amplified through biblical and classical traditions, ensured that Babylon would never truly vanish from the human imagination. For the local population, however, life went on in modest ways. Small communities persisted within the ruins, maintaining agricultural activity and local trade. Some temples may have continued limited worship into the early Common Era, while Parthian garrisons used parts of the site for strategic purposes. Excavations have revealed traces of modest habitation from this time. Simple dwellings constructed within the shells of ancient palaces and sanctuaries. The grandeur had gone, but the land remained inhabited, its people living among the vestiges of their ancestors. In historical perspective, the Parthian period represents Babylon's transformation from a living city into a monument of memory. Its administrative systems, religious traditions, and intellectual contributions had been absorbed into new empires and cultural frameworks. Yet the site itself, silent, decaying, but enduring, continued to symbolize the deep roots of civilization. For historians and archaeologists, this stage of Babylon's history underscores a broader truth. Great cities may fall, but their influence persists in the ideas, institutions, and languages they leave behind. By the end of the Parthian period, around the 2nd century CE, Babylon had ceased to function as an urban center. Its temples crumbled, its archives lay buried beneath layers of earth, and its language was lost to time. But the story of Babylon was far from over. In the centuries that followed, travelers, empires, and scholars would rediscover its ruins, reviving its legacy as the birthplace of writing, law, and empire itself. For nearly 2,000 years after its decline, the site of Babylon lay silent beneath layers of earth and myth. Travelers passed through the plains of Mesopotamia, noting scattered ruins and mounds of brick, but few grasped the scale of what once stood there. When European exploration of the Near East began in earnest during the 18th and 19th centuries, Babylon re-emerged, not as a living city, but as a subject of fascination, archaeology, and historical reconstruction. Its rediscovery transformed both the study of history and humanity's understanding of civilization itself. Early identification of the site was guided by classical and biblical sources. Writers such as Herodotus, Strabo, and Pliny the Elder had described Babylon's grandeur in terms that bordered on the legendary. Walls vast enough for chariots to ride upon, temples reaching the heavens. The Book of Genesis and other biblical texts, meanwhile, associated Babylon with human pride and divine punishment, particularly through the story of the Tower of Babel. By the 17th century, European travelers in Mesopotamia, including Pietro della Valle and later Carsten Niebuhr, began recording the remains near the modern town of Hilla on the Euphrates River. They identified the great mounds called Babil, Khazar, and Amran ibn Ali as the ruins of ancient Babylon. Yet it was not until the 19th century that systematic exploration began. In 1811, Claudius James Rich, a British East India Company resident in Baghdad, conducted the first detailed survey of the site. His meticulous sketches and measurements provided the foundation for later archaeological work. Rich's descriptions of massive walls, scattered inscriptions, and the telltale baked bricks bearing the names of kings like Nebuchadnezzar II captured the imagination of scholars and the public alike. His publications brought Babylon out of myth and into the realm of historical inquiry. Over the following decades, excavation efforts intensified. The German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, beginning in 1899, undertook the most comprehensive and scientifically rigorous exploration of Babylon to date. Over 18 years, his team unearthed vast portions of the ancient city, including the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, and the royal palaces of Nebuchadnezzar II. These discoveries confirmed the accuracy of many ancient accounts and revealed the architectural sophistication of Babylonian urban planning. The Ishtar Gate, with its glazed blue bricks and reliefs of lions, dragons, and bulls, became an icon of Mesopotamian art and power. Today, its reconstructed form stands in Berlin's Pergamon Museum, one of archaeology's most striking achievements. Coldway's excavations also shed light on the city's layout, the double walls, the grid of streets, and the placement of temples and administrative complexes. The discovery of cuneiform tablets provided a direct voice from Babylon's inhabitants, preserving contracts, correspondence, and chronicles that spanned more than a millennium. These documents transformed the study of Mesopotamian history from speculation into evidence-based scholarship. They revealed a society governed by written law, meticulous record-keeping, and a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy. Through them, the Babylonian world became not a legend, but a documented civilization. The rediscovery of Babylon coincided with the broader development of Assyriology, the academic discipline devoted to the study of Mesopotamian languages and history. In 1857, scholars successfully deciphered cuneiform, unlocking a vast archive of inscriptions from across the region. For the first time, the names of Hammurabi, Sargon, and Nebuchadnezzar could be read in their original languages. The resulting flood of information transformed ancient Near Eastern studies. Babylon, long regarded as a symbol of decadence or moral decline, was recast as a center of innovation, the birthplace of writing, law, and organized urban life. Modern archaeology further deepened this understanding. Excavations conducted by Iraqi and international teams throughout the 20th century uncovered residential areas, temple complexes, and the remnants of the Edamananke ziggurat, once associated with the biblical Tower of Babel. Scientific dating techniques confirmed the city's continuous occupation from the 3rd millennium BCE through the Parthian period. These findings provided an unbroken narrative of urban development, political evolution, and cultural adaptation spanning more than 2,500 years, a continuity unmatched in ancient history. However, the rediscovery of Babylon also raised questions about heritage and preservation. The site suffered from looting, erosion, and unregulated construction during periods of instability. In the late 20th century, restoration efforts were undertaken under the government of Saddam Hussein, who sought to associate modern Iraq with the glories of Babylon's past. New bricks bearing his name were added to reconstructed walls, echoing Nebuchadnezzar's ancient inscriptions. While these reconstructions revived interest in the site, they also blurred the line between archaeology and political symbolism. International heritage organizations later worked to protect Babylon's authenticity, emphasizing preservation over reconstruction. In 2019, Babylon was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing its unparalleled significance to human history. The decision acknowledged both its ancient achievements and the complex legacy of its rediscovery. Today, the ruins near Hilla remain a focus of archaeological research and cultural reflection. The Ishtar Gate's fragments, scattered across museums worldwide, continue to inspire awe, while digital technology enables scholars to reconstruct Babylon virtually, restoring not its empire, but its memory. The modern rediscovery of Babylon thus completed a historical circle. What began as a myth of pride and punishment became a story of endurance and rediscovery. Archaeology transformed a biblical symbol into a tangible civilization, one that revealed humanity's capacity for organization, law, and innovation long before the classical world arose. Through careful excavation and study, the city that once defined empire and culture once again shaped our understanding of civilization itself. The rediscovery of Babylon revealed not only a vanished city, but a lasting intellectual legacy. Long after its walls fell and its empire dissolved, the ideas conceived in Babylon continued to shape human civilization in governance, science, architecture, and the written word. The influence of Babylonian thought stretched far beyond Mesopotamia, forming an unseen foundation for much of the modern world. Among Babylon's greatest contributions was its systematization of law. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed around 1750 BCE, is one of humanity's earliest known legal codes. More than a set of decrees, it was an assertion that law should be public, consistent, and binding upon ruler and subject alike. The principle of codified justice, that the strong should not oppress the weak, introduced an enduring concept that governance required accountability and transparency. Centuries later, similar ideals appeared in the Roman 12 Tables, the Justinian Code, and eventually in the charters of modern states. Hammurabi's stele, now preserved in the Louvre Museum, remains a symbol of the transition from arbitrary rule to structured governance. Babylon's intellectual heritage extended deeply into astronomy and mathematics. The Babylonians developed a sexagesimal, base, 60, system, which remains embedded in today's timekeeping and angular measurement: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Their astronomers meticulously recorded celestial movements on clay tablets, creating one of the earliest long-term astronomical archives in history. These records, preserved over centuries, allowed Babylonian scholars to identify planetary cycles and predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy. When Greek philosophers later encountered this data, they built upon it to construct the foundations of classical astronomy. Even the famed Ptolemaic system of the cosmos owes a debt to Babylonian observation and notation. In architecture and urban planning, Babylon set precedents that influenced later imperial capitals. The city's monumental structures, the ziggurat, the Ishtar Gate, and the vast processional way, expressed the idea of the city as cosmos, a structured microcosm of divine order. This concept, linking urban design to spiritual and political hierarchy, reappeared in later civilizations, in the axial layouts of Persian capitals like Persepolis, in Hellenistic urban centers, and in the sacred geometry of medieval and Islamic cities. Babylon demonstrated that architecture could embody ideology, a principle that empires would employ for millennia. Equally transformative was Babylon's role in record-keeping and administration. Through the invention and refinement of cuneiform writing, Babylonian scribes preserved not only royal decrees, but economic transactions, scientific observations, and literary works. This bureaucratic precision enabled complex economies to function across large territories. The archives of the Eanna Temple in Uruk and the business tablets of Sippar and Nippur illustrate a world in which writing sustained governance, trade, and taxation. This administrative rationality became a model for later imperial systems, from Persia's satrapies to Rome's provinces. Babylon also shaped the intellectual continuity of the ancient Near East. When the Persians conquered Mesopotamia in the 6th century BCE, they retained many Babylonian officials and scribes. Babylon remained a center of learning under the Achaemenid Empire, preserving temple schools and astronomical traditions. Even under foreign rule, its scholars continued to update celestial records and interpret omens. Through the transmission of these texts, Babylon's knowledge reached the Hellenistic world following Alexander the Great's conquest. The astronomer Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century BCE, became one of the earliest cultural mediators between Mesopotamia and the classical world. Babylon's intellectual legacy also survived in religious and mythological thought. Elements of Babylonian cosmology, such as the ordering of the universe from chaos and the concept of divine kingship, influenced later theological systems in the Near East. The creation epic Enuma Elish, which describes the god Marduk establishing order over primordial waters, bears structural parallels to narratives found in Hebrew and later Christian texts. While these resemblances are products of cultural transmission rather than direct borrowing, they illustrate the far-reaching influence of Babylonian ideas on the moral and metaphysical frameworks of later societies. In the modern era, Babylon's legacy resurfaced not only in archaeology, but also in scholarship and science. The rediscovery of cuneiform revealed the intellectual sophistication of early Mesopotamian thought, prompting historians to reevaluate the origins of civilization itself. Babylon became recognized as one of the primary cradles of human knowledge, a civilization that combined empirical observation with administrative innovation long before the rise of Greece or Rome. Its systematic approach to record-keeping, measurement, and urban management laid the groundwork for the concept of the state as an organized entity. The endurance of Babylon's intellectual influence lies in its universality. Its innovations were not bound by ethnicity or geography. They addressed fundamental challenges of human society: how to measure time, govern justly, and coordinate collective effort. In this sense, Babylon's contributions belong not only to its region but to humanity as a whole. Every clock, every contract, every city grid carries faint echoes of that ancient world between the Tigris and Euphrates. By the time the ruins of Babylon were unearthed, its legacy had already become inseparable from the story of civilization itself. What began as local innovation in Mesopotamia evolved into the structural logic of empires and modern institutions. Babylon's rediscovery in the 19th century merely confirmed what its influence had already proven: that knowledge, once written in clay, can outlast empires and reawaken the past in the minds of the living. Though the physical city of Babylon fell millennia ago, its name has endured, evolving from a geographical term into a symbol woven through religion, art, and modern politics. Over the centuries, Babylon has come to signify many things: the might of empire, the perils of arrogance, and the resilience of human achievement. This transformation from historical city to enduring metaphor reveals how deeply Babylon continues to shape the world's cultural imagination. In the biblical tradition, Babylon became synonymous with moral decay and divine retribution. The stories of the Tower of Babel and the Babylonian exile gave the city lasting theological resonance. To early Jewish and later Christian writers, Babylon symbolized both oppression and spiritual testing, a place where human pride challenged divine authority. The Book of Revelation transformed it further into a prophetic symbol of worldly corruption, referring to Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, a representation of imperial excess and moral downfall. In this religious framing, Babylon ceased to be merely a place. It became a warning, a moral geography mapping the boundary between faith and hubris. Yet outside theology, Babylon also inspired admiration and wonder. Classical and later scholars, from Herodotus to Alexander the Great, spoke of its immense walls, gardens, and temples. Renaissance humanists, fascinated by the rediscovery of ancient texts, viewed Babylon as a lost chapter of human brilliance rather than sin. Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire and Gibbon studied it as evidence of the early sophistication of Eastern civilizations, challenging Eurocentric ideas about the origins of progress. In this intellectual revival, Babylon emerged not as a cautionary tale, but as a monument to the universality of human reason. The 19th century, an age of exploration and empire, brought Babylon back into tangible reality. When Robert Coldway's excavations revealed the Ishtar Gate and the processional way, they reintroduced Babylon as both an archaeological wonder and a symbol of human continuity. European museums displayed its artifacts as testaments to civilization's shared ancestry. At the same time, Babylon's imagery began to permeate literature and art. William Blake, Gustave Doré, and later T.S. Eliot invoked it as a metaphor for alienation, empire, and the modern city itself. Babylon became shorthand for grandeur and downfall, the eternal cycle of human ambition. In the 20th century, the name took on new political and cultural dimensions. In the Middle East, Babylon became a touchstone of national identity, particularly in Iraq, where successive governments sought to claim the legacy of Mesopotamian greatness. Under Saddam Hussein, extensive restorations and nationalist symbolism linked modern Iraq to Babylon's imperial past. Bricks stamped with his name echoed Nebuchadnezzar's ancient inscriptions, fusing archaeology with ideology. Though these efforts were politically charged, they underscored a profound truth. Babylon's story remains central to the identity of the land once called Mesopotamia. Beyond the Middle East, Babylon evolved into a global cultural motif. In the African diaspora, particularly within Rastafarian thought, Babylon came to represent systems of oppression and spiritual captivity, a world estranged from righteousness. This reinterpretation, drawn from biblical imagery, gave the term renewed moral force. In reggae music and anti-colonial discourse, Babylon symbolized resistance against corrupt authority and exile from one's cultural origins. Thus, an ancient Mesopotamian city became a metaphor for modern struggles of identity, freedom, and justice, proof of its enduring psychological power. In popular culture, Babylon has appeared across genres, from novels and films to architecture and music. Fritz Lang's 1927 film Metropolis, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, and numerous modern dystopias draw upon Babylonian motifs of vast, stratified cities embodying both technological glory and moral peril. The Hanging Gardens, though never definitively located, remain one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient wonder. Even in digital culture, the name Babylon often denotes knowledge, complexity, or the duality of progress and decline, themes as ancient as the empire itself. Scholars continue to debate Babylon's real and symbolic meanings. Archaeology grounds it in measurable history, bricks, tablets, and strata of habitation. Yet literature and religion have elevated it beyond the physical. Few ancient names have traveled so far across time and meaning. Egypt's Thebes and Greece's Athens symbolize specific cultural ideals. Babylon, by contrast, has become a mirror through which societies reflect on power, morality, and memory. Its ruins remind the modern world that civilization's achievements are inseparable from its vulnerabilities. In recent decades, renewed efforts have aimed to preserve Babylon's archaeological integrity and reinterpret its story for global audiences. UNESCO's 2019 designation as a World Heritage Site marked a turning point, from viewing Babylon as myth or propaganda to recognizing it as a shared chapter of human heritage. Ongoing conservation and digital reconstruction projects allow visitors and scholars alike to engage with the city as it was, a living, evolving metropolis shaped by human intellect and belief. Babylon now stands not only as a relic of empire, but as a case study in the continuity of civilization. Ultimately, Babylon's endurance in modern imagination testifies to the power of cultural memory. It began as a city of clay and canals, became an empire of laws and monuments, and lives on as an idea that transcends geography. To speak of Babylon today is to invoke the entire arc of civilization, creation, organization, ambition, and fall. In its story lies both the triumph and the humility of the human endeavor, the recognition that every empire, no matter how grand, is built upon the same fragile foundation of time. Babylon's story reminds us that history is more than the record of empires. It is the inheritance of humanity's learning. Each artifact unearthed, each inscription deciphered, brings us closer to understanding who we are and how we came to be. As new discoveries emerge from the sands of Mesopotamia, they continue to rewrite what we know about civilization's first great experiment in order and knowledge. Explore history. Question the past. Because every civilization we uncover is, in part, our own reflection.